Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Cindy had many fond memories of her father, but there was one favorite that happened on her 8th birthday. "Come on, Dad, come on." She'd been pestering him all morning. "Where are we going?" "To the carousel." Stephen smiles slyly. "Not guessed." He lightly flicks her obediently on the very nose. Cindy laughs. "But Dad, the zoo is closer." Think, such a clue has stumped the girl. Not the zoo, but something close. A zoological museum. Dad shakes his head no. "Come here, let's do your hair." Cindy obediently comes over, and her father, with deft, confident movements, unravels the paper curlers he had curled for her the night before. In a few minutes, little Cindy's head is covered with shiny black curls. Stephen admires them with a smile, looks into his daughter's big green eyes, and says, "How do you look like her?" Little Cindy frowns her eyebrows perplexed, not understanding what her father is talking about. But then a sudden realization lights up her face. "I realized the oceanarium." That's right, sunshine. Each tank was illuminated with a bluish glow that made the fish inside seem almost magical. They floated lightly in the clear water like birds of paradise hovering in the air. Bright red, yellow, green, with long transparent fins and big round eyes. There were real sharks, turtles with fleshy flippers, and even the usual herring that Cindy had seen at the market when she went grocery shopping with her dad. Near each aquarium they stopped, looking for the corresponding sign that said the name of the inhabitant. In English and Latin, it listed the habitat and adult size. It was the day Cindy remembered most often even years later, especially after her father died. She was 22 at the time, seemingly an adult, but she still misses him. Stephen Randolph was born and raised in a small backwoods village a few hours from the capital. His parents were simple, working people, having lived in the village all their lives, as had their parents and their parents' parents. But Stephen stood out from childhood for his intelligence and curiosity. He was the best student at school and often asked questions that stumped his teachers. His father wanted his only son to follow in his footsteps and stay in the village. But Stephen didn't want to hear about it. "There's nothing good about this town," grumbled Randolph Sr. "I went to the army for a few years when I was young. And then I saw the light everywhere the same. I couldn't find anything better than my home village." 16, Stephen finished school and left to go to Washington, to the university. He saw his father only once afterward, when he came to attend his mother's funeral 10 years later. Instead of coming together under the weight of shared grief, father and son quarreled even more, even when Stephen married and Cindy was born. He did not take his wife and daughter to meet his mother-in-law and grandfather. In work, Stephen was persistent and hardworking. He was the first in his course to defend his PhD, and then became the youngest doctoral candidate in the history of the department. He was a member of the academic council. And although Randolph was young, the opinion of the brilliant zoologist was considered by many, as his scientific discoveries found application in the field of agriculture. Government agencies willingly recognized the young Professor Randolph. After several years of work, he was allocated a huge, beautiful house in an elite suburban village and a company car with a personal driver. Despite such privileges, Stephen remained the same modest and pleasant person. A couple of years later, he married his graduate student Nancy. She immediately attracted him with her huge green eyes, which seemed even bigger and more expressive behind her glasses, and a thick black braid almost to her waist. Their marriage was happy but short-lived. Just a couple of months after the marriage, Nancy became pregnant. The labor was difficult, with complications. Fortunately, little Cindy survived, but Nancy never recovered. She died a month later. She was never released from the hospital. Stephen felt the death of his beloved wife very hard. Probably, if it were not for the thought that the little girl had no one but him, he would have followed his beloved, Nadia. But his daughter needed him. The workload had to be reduced. Anything that could be transferred to the house. Stephen devoted himself to learning the new science of fatherhood. At first, it was difficult to get up in the middle of the night, dilute the formula for an hour, rocking a screaming baby in his arms, walk with her every day, bathe, wash diapers, play. offered help to hire a professional nanny to give to the nursery. Familiar and unmarried women also then actively sought to visit the young widower, and the presence of a young daughter did not embarrass them at all. Stephen stubbornly refused help and women's attention, preferring to bring up the only child alone. The professor managed. When Cindy became a little older, he began to take her to work with him. The daughter learned to read at the age of 5 and has been able to entertain herself ever since. While her father lectured, conducted experiments, recorded the results of observations, she could sit all day in a corner of his office and read a book. Gradually, everyone at the university got used to Cindy. Students, graduate students, other professors greeted her, asked how she was doing, patronized if possible, then drink tea, then entertain. Everyone thought that Cindy would follow in her father's footsteps and become a zoologist too. Stephen himself hoped so, but did not pressurize his daughter, believing that she herself will choose what she wants. Cindy entered the Pedagogical Institute. Probably a long stay at the university and hundreds of hours spent on the back pairs of father's lectures played a role here. Stephen supported her decision. He himself could no longer work as intensively as he used to. The years were taking their toll. The professor decided to educate a worthy successor. That's when Andrew appeared in their house. The young and promising graduate student was writing his master's thesis under Stephen's supervision. That's when Cindy met him. She was already in her second year. She changed from a little girl with black pigtails into a tall, slender girl with thick black hair, which she cut to her shoulders. Despite her father's objections, Andrew immediately took notice of her. When Cindy was home, they often drank coffee together, sometimes talking. If the professor was busy with something, she liked the young graduate student too, a tall, blue-eyed blonde, always in an impeccably tailored suit, his hair nested. He smelled like limes and walnuts. He was also, in addition to zoology, pretty good at modern movies and music. He was always easy and fun to be with. It was as if his father didn't mind their socializing either. Even though Andrew and Cindy never sought each other anywhere but the professor's house. And then Stephen had a heart attack. Cindy was at school that day, and his father was about to give a lecture to graduate students. When the students entered the auditorium, they found the professor sitting on the floor with his back leaning against the lectern. He was as pale as chalk, his face covered with pale beads of sweat. A trembling hand was trying to undo the button of his shirt. "Stephen, what's the matter with you?" Immediately, one of the graduate students jumped up to him. "Hearts," barely audibly whispered the professor. "Call an ambulance." The doctors came quickly, measured his blood pressure, took a cardiogram, and said that it was urgent to go to the hospital. "Will someone go with him?" The doctor asked. "Am I going?" Andrew said firmly. Right from the car, he called Cindy, who immediately rushed to the hospital. "How is he?" she asked when she saw Andrew in the emergency room. He shrugged his shoulders. "They haven't said anything yet. I'm waiting." Cindy was breathing frequently. I could see her shoulders going up and down, and her hands shaking as if she was about to cry. "He'll be fine," Andrew said confidently. Though the guy wasn't sure of it himself, he realized how important it was to comfort her now. He cautiously approached the girl and put his arm around her thin, implied shoulders. "Cindy, it's going to be okay," he repeated softly. She kicked, sobbing, and pressed herself against him with all her slim little body. "Andrew, I'm so afraid for him," quietly whispered Cindy. With one hand, he awkwardly stroked her black hair, and with the other, he lightly put his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that for several minutes, until at last a stern male voice sounded. "Who are Randolph's relatives?" Cindy sobbed and pulled away from Andrew's shoulder. "I'm Yoo-hoo, the daughter." "And the daughter?" "Good. Then come with me." "Well, she can come with you if she wants." I didn't start Andrew, but I hesitated when I saw the pleading look in Cindy's eyes. He realized how frightened she was to be alone now, so he took her hand, and together they followed the doctor. They were led down a long, narrow corridor, the walls of which were painted pale green from those walls, from the flashing lamps. Cindy was so uncomfortable she wanted to run away. She was terrified to think that now she would find out that her father was gone. Only Andrew, whose hand she clutched, gave her strength. "Come in," the doctor said, ushering them into the office. There behind the desk, staring at the computer monitor, sat a heavyset, tired man in an old pale blue surgical suit. He looked up as Cindy and Andrew entered and waved his hand, indicating the 2 chairs in front of his desk. "Cindy Randolph?" he asked, catching a glimpse of Cindy and then staring back at the monitor. "Yes," dry lips, the girl replied. "Your father had a heart attack," the man said. Cindy sobbed, hula, and tears streamed down her face. "What on earth are you?" The doctor exclaimed in surprise and deftly motioned a packet of tissues to her. Cindy nodded gratefully and began to wipe her face hastily. The doctor continued. "Fortunately, he was taken to the hospital in time. We put him on Stan." "Stan what?" Andrew asked. "A Stan," repeated the doctor. "Roughly speaking, it is a metal spring that is inserted through a small puncture in the arm and is guided to the heart by a conductor. This spring is inserted into a vessel that's been blocked. That's what caused the heart attack." He looked at Cindy and Andrew's faces and sighed. "But you don't need to go into those details. The most important thing is that we've restored blood flow to the arteries that feed the hearts. Everything's fine now. Of course, he'll be in the hospital for a few days, but then you can take him back. Will he be able to continue working?" Andrew asked. Cindy looked at him in surprise. That's what he was thinking now. "Well, in time he probably will be able to," said the doctor. "But it's too early to talk about that now. He would need to go through rehabilitation." The aspirant nodded, shook his lip, and wondered when he could see him. Asked Cindy. The doctor hesitated. "Come tomorrow afternoon. It's good to bring him. Go to the nurse at the post. She will give you a list." "Thank you very much." The doctor nodded. "Have a good day." He stared at the monitor again, typing rapidly. Andrew gently touched Cindy's arm. They got up and left the office. "Wait for me here," the boy said. He found the post and the nurse, took from her a list of things Stephen needed to bring tomorrow, and returned to Cindy. "Let's go. I'll walk you home." In the cab, she snuggled against him, laid her head on his shoulder, and fell asleep. He put his arm gently around her shoulder. "Come on, Cindy, here we are," Andrew said. When the car stopped, she lost her eyes, frightened from the pellets from him. "Sorry, I fell asleep." "It's okay, let's go." It was dark and cold at home. Andrew turned on the light and put the kettle on. Cindy, looking around confusedly, as if she had not yet fully awakened without her father. The house was unaccustomedly quiet. As they drank tea, she imagined Andrew leaving now, and she would be alone in this huge house. The girl looked up at him several times, but not daring to speak, lowered her gaze. "Are you all right?" Andrew asked her. She shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know," Cindy whispered. "I still can't seem to believe it happened." "He's actually going to be all right," Cindy cried. She hadn't realized she could cry so often before. I guess she just didn't have enough reason to, other than the death of her mom, which she didn't even remember. It was like there were no events in her life worth crying over. Simply because Daddy had always kept her safe from any kind of trouble. And now Daddy's life was hanging in the balance. She couldn't believe that everything was fine, and she would only be able to see him, talk to him, hold his hand tomorrow. And tonight, she'd have to spend the whole night alone. "If you want, I'll stay with you tonight," Andrew suddenly said. "I'll lie down on your sofa in the living room." Cindy looked up at him hopefully. "Really, you will?" "Sure. Let's just lie down slowly. It's been a long day. We need to get some sleep." Even though it wasn't that late. After saying that, Cindy felt how tired she was. "Go to sleep in the shower," Andrew told her affectionately. "I'll do the dishes myself." She nodded and brought him bedding and towels. She herself went to the bathroom and stood under the hot shower until her whole body opened up, streaming, and it became impossible to breathe from the steam. But despite that, she felt better. Her body felt as if it had relaxed. Cindy barely made it to bed and fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. After a few days, they were allowed to take Stephen out of the hospital. Though he seemed thinner and a little slower, he was trying to stay awake and smiling. "Home at last," he exclaimed joyfully as he crossed the threshold. "I had no more strength to eat this hospital porridge and soup." Now it's like eating all the fried potatoes. Yeah, of course, Cindy exclaimed sternly. They gave you a diet? I'm going to make sure you stick to it. And Andrew will help me. The aspirant smiled and shrugged, answering Stephen's perplexed look. It couldn't be helped. He would have to comply. The professor hummed and looked at his daughter with interest. I see you two have grown close in my absence. Cindy blushed, bit her lower lip, but answered Andrew has been very helpful and supportive. Thank you, Andrew, said the professor seriously to the student. I kept worrying, how are you going to sleep alone in the house? Cindy did not dare to tell her father that the graduate student had been staying with them almost all this time. Let's have lunch, she said, and finally have a normal conversation with you. We need to discuss plans for the future. What kind of plans? The professor was surprised. Do you need to go to rehab, take sick leave at work or vacation? I don't know. I'll probably get an academic to look after you. Stephen raised his eyebrows. Okay, stop. What is this? Has it started? What academic? What vacation? I feel fine. Daddy. Cindy looked at her father sternly. He suddenly thought she looked a lot like his mother. In those rare moments when she was reprimanding students, you had a heart attack, surgery. You need to recover. You can't go to work in a few days like nothing happened. Dad sighed. All right, let's get this straight. Okay, I'm willing to take some sick leave for a while. Maybe a month. Then I'll go back to work. But even with those sick days, I'm not going to stop working with Andrew. We've got a PhD to write. The defense is just around the corner. At that moment, the graduate student gave a sigh of relief. The professor continued, you do not go to any academy, continue your studies. That's all. Silence reigned in the house. All right, Cindy said at last, but you will take care of yourself. Father smiled at Boodoo. Andrew will look after me, won't he? He turned to the graduate student, who nodded gravely. Stephen was recovering quickly. His work seemed to be helping him. As he had promised his daughter, he reduced the number of working hours, left lectures, and work with Andrew. The latter, by the way, was practically living with them. He no longer concealed his attitude towards Cindy, and she too showed openly that she sympathized with Andrew. At first, Stephen pretended not to notice anything. He just watched his daughter and the graduate student. But after a while, he chose a moment when Cindy was not at home and started talking to the student. What's going on with you and Cindy? Is it serious? Stephen looked carefully at the graduate student. He flinched in surprise and then drew an air noisily and deeply. But still he resolutely pursed his lips and looked at the professor. Yes, Professor, I like her very much. Cindy is the most wonderful girl I have ever met. And my intentions concerning her are very serious. The professor nodded contentedly. Do you want to marry her? Andrew sighed. Cindy wants to study. We haven't discussed our future much at all yet. Besides, she's worried about you and wasn't going to say anything at all until you recovered it. Why wouldn't she want to worry? But such worries are pleasant for me. The professor smiled, and Andrew imperceptibly exhaled in relief. So, are you going to marry Cindy? The aspirant, who had already decided that the unpleasant conversation was already over. He tensed up again. Yes, I plan to propose to her, he replied. When the right moment comes? Stephen nodded, as if he had expected such an answer. He stood up, walked over to a wooden cabinet, opened it, and took out a glass decanter of brown liquid and 2 clear, wide glasses. The professor poured about the thickness of a finger into each of the glasses and held out one of the containers to the graduate student. Andrew looked at the professor incredulously, but took the glass. It smelled of cognac. A colleague gave it to me for my anniversary, Stephen explained. A real one from Armenia. 7 years old, that's the one. In the corner. Let's have a drink, Andrew. Stephen, I don't drink. Andrew, are you trying to get your PhD? The graduate student looked at him incredulously. It was impossible to understand whether the professor was joking at this moment, or he's dead serious. Just in case, Andrew added, you're not allowed. Cindy will swear a little, but we won't tell. It's okay, we'll just throw it down and drink it. Andrew wrinkled his nose, but tried not to show it to the professor. Okay, what we have for an appetizer? The men made themselves a couple of sandwiches, then drank some more. We need to get this wedding thing settled soon, Andrew. I may not have much time left. I wouldn't want to miss this moment in my daughter's life. Because of the soon-to-be-dead Pike, the graduate student's eyes reddened, glistening slightly. Widening his neck with pupils, he looked fearfully at his future father-in-law. Professor, come on. Don't interrupt. Student. You're all right. Andrew, that's enough. The professor suddenly became very serious. He sat down on a chair and called Andrew to sit next to him too. Yes, at first glance I'm fine, Stephen said calmly. But the doctors told me that there will always be the possibility of another heart attack. And it's not a fact that I'll be lucky next time, and you can't predict when it will happen. It's impossible. Maybe I'll live quietly and peacefully for another 20 to 30 years, or maybe I'll be gone tomorrow. Andrew burst at the thought that Stephen might not be. He felt a little uncomfortable. It's true. It's true. Andrew, the professor nodded. That's why I'm having this conversation. Do you understand? Cindy has no one but me. I'd like to know that she'll be all right after I'm gone. Andrew pressed his lips together, sighed, and looked resolutely at his professor. You can rest assured that I will not leave her behind. Of course, in light of these events, I am willing to reconsider my plans for marriage. I take it you don't want Cindy to know about it. The professor sighed. She doesn't want any unnecessary excitement. I'll talk to her myself, if you say so, Professor. Cindy was somewhat embarrassed when her father spoke to her about future marriages. Even though she guessed he was aware of her relationship with Andrew, it was still strange to think that he knew his little girl had grown up. It also seemed like she wasn't ready for marriage yet. Do you love him? Her father asked bluntly. Cindy blushed, but looked firmly at Stephen and nodded. Well, that settled the question. Dad, I'm only 20. Maybe it's too early to think about getting married. The professor grinned. What does it matter what time to do it? If you love a man and want to be with him. Besides, I suggest you live here. Cindy raised her eyebrows in surprise. Here, in our house. Dad smiled. There's plenty of room for everyone, and you'll be more comfortable. And me. If you want, you can get your own place. If you don't, you can stay here. Cindy thought about it. The thing that frightened her most was the separation from her father. How would he be without her? What if something happened to him and she wasn't there? Perhaps staying in their family home would be the best option. Why do you insist on getting married? Cindy asked with a suspicious squint. I've become suspicious, sighed my father. Well, I'll be honest with you, I'm an old school man. You may think I'm conservative, but now that you have a young man, I'd like you and him to be serious. Cindy blushed, but nodded, accepting that explanation as satisfactory. The next day, Andrew proposed to her. Everything as it should be. Restaurant Kalina ring. Is this about Dad? Cindy asked him sternly, ignoring the curious looks of the other people at the tables. He smiled and shrugged. He and I had a serious conversation, and I'm glad we did. I've been thinking about our relationship, and I really want us to get married and start living together. Well, then I agree. They got married 3 months later, exactly 1 week after Andrew defended his PhD thesis. Stephen seemed even happier than the two newlyweds. The only time his face darkened was when Cindy, making the guest list, cautiously asked Dad, My grandfather, he's still alive. Should we call him? Stephen frowned. I don't know, Cindy. I don't want to know. We won't call him. He's never seen you in his life, and he's had no part in your upbringing. Cindy was even a little frightened. She had never seen her father like this. A couple of times in her life, she had tried to talk about Grandpa and find out what had happened between them. But Daddy wouldn't tell her anything. Apart from that episode, the wedding preparations, though still a nerve-wracking experience, were remembered by Cindy as a very happy time. In fact, the first year after their wedding was the same. The newlyweds were quite uncomfortable in the big house. Andrew took a job in the pulpit under the patronage of Stephen. There he was settling in quite successfully and hoped to take up a professorship. Not in the near future, of course, but perhaps sometime in the future. 6 months later, Stephen signed the house over to Cindy. Despite the fact that outwardly he looked good and told everyone around him that he felt fine. In reality, the professor felt that he was slowly getting weaker every day. For simple habitual actions, he needed to spend more effort than before. It became not so easy to read lectures, scientific papers, and he himself almost did not study. Of course, he explained it by the fact that now there was Andrew young talent. Let him gain experience, and he professor, if anything, will prompt and help. Stephen was glad that he had time to marry off his daughter, that there would be a man who would take care of her, that she would not be left alone, without support, as he was in his time. After thinking about it, he wrote a letter to her father. He sent it. There was no reply. Stephen died suddenly, as he had feared. He had a seizure at work before a lecture, just like last time. This time, however, there was no miracle. The infarction turned out to be too extensive, and despite the best efforts of the doctors, the professor died. When Cindy learned of her father's death, she for a long time could not believe that it was true. Even when the girl went to the hospital, to the last she hoped that there was a monstrous mistake, that now she would arrive. She would be invited into the office and said, "Cindy Randolph, I'm sorry, please, we mixed up. It's not your father died. Stephen is fine. You can go to his room. Moore and Andrew flew to another city that day for a conference and will not be able to return until tomorrow morning." Cindy felt completely helpless. It was frightening to be left without the support of both men at once. She was so accustomed to be near them, to feel that she was safely protected from all the troubles of this world. And now, all of a sudden, she was all alone. She wanted to just run home, crawl under the covers, and lie there waiting for her husband to return. But she couldn't do that. She had to pull herself together and start to act, talk to the doctors, sign the necessary documents, inform the institute, call her father's friends, and start organizing the funeral. She doesn't even remember how it lasted until her husband arrived. Everything happened as if in a dream. She was signing things, picking things up, calling someone, telling them that Daddy had died. She told them what had happened, responded to condolences, and never even cried once. Only the next morning, when she heard the key turning in the keyhole, she saw her husband coming into the house. She rushed toward him, hugged him as hard as she could, and sobbed. Cindy quietly said, "Andrew, Cindy, everything will be all right." After the professor's death, the atmosphere in their home slowly began to change. At first, Cindy attributed it to her depressed mood after her father's death. She realized that not only she felt bad, but also her husband, who was his main student. In addition, after Stephen's death, he had to take over some of his responsibilities. He began to stay late at work more often, coming home angry and upset. He often berated other employees of the department and institute of the Ministry of Education, who did not understand or appreciate him. He said that the salary of an employee of his level was ridiculous, that he would rather quit everything and go into business. Cindy tried to support him as best she could, even though her own condition left much to be desired. Sometimes she missed her father very much, especially here in this house, where everything reminded her of him. Sometimes she even wanted to offer her husband to sell the house and take an apartment in a new building in a new neighborhood, where they would start their life from scratch. But as soon as she began to think about it seriously, immediately she imagined leaving the house she remembered from her early childhood. On this wall, there are still the old pencil marks Papa used to mark her height. The ceiling in the kitchen has 3 strange, uneven stains that can't be cleaned. There she was making her first pie, which for some reason after she took it out of the oven, exploded, flying all over the kitchen. For the first second, she was afraid that Daddy would swear, but he only asked, "Are you okay?" And after her uncertain nod, he laughed and said, "Experimenter," she was all over her dad. She knew about this house and all she could walk through it with her eyes closed without fear of falling or tripping. And at the thought of having to leave her nest, Cindy felt sick to her stomach. But as time went on after her father's death, it didn't get any better. It seemed as if she and Andrew were growing apart. He seemed to be more and more absorbed in his work and less time with his wife. "We don't seem to be together much lately," Cindy once said to her husband. "Have we?" Andrew asked in surprise. "Hadn't you noticed? Think of the last time we went out together." The husband frowned and took off his glasses. He was giving a presentation today and wanted to run through the presentation before he left the house. And fighting with his wife didn't fit in with his plans at all. The quickest way to settle the matter was to agree with Cindy. "Let her hear what she wants to hear, dear," he said in a soft voice. "You're right, aren't you?" Cindy sighed. "I've actually started to work harder," Andrew said. "But there's no other way now. This is my chance, you see. All these years I've been living in your father's shadow, and now I have to show that I'm worth something. You don't want me to be known only as the son-in-law of the famous Professor Randolph, to be thought I married you because you're his daughter." She went up to her husband, put her arms around him. "I'm sorry, of course, I understand that. It's hard for you right now." He hugged his wife back and sighed, "You have no idea how difficult it is for me. There's a report today. If I do well, there's a chance I'll get noticed." "Well then, good luck to you." She kissed her husband. "Thank you, darling, I have to go." He gently released himself from her embrace. "I'll try to make time to be together." "Thank you, darling." Yes, there was no scandal this time. Andrew thought with relief as he got into the car. He still had a little time before the show, just in time to have coffee with Helen. "How worried are you?" she asked after a long kiss, putting her hand on his knee and lightly engulfing it. He habitually glanced around. There was hardly anyone in the cafe, but caution still wouldn't hurt. Helen, of course, noticed his gaze, grinned with her plump, bright pink lips, and pulled her hand away. "Come on, there's no one here." "I don't want to take any chances," he replied coldly. "She doesn't suspect anything." "Yeah," Andrew muttered. Except that today she wasn't happy that we weren't spending enough time together. Helen shrugged. Most wives whose husbands cheat on them have the same complaint. Andrew wrinkled his nose. She laughed. Come on. How much longer are you going to pretend to care about her?" He sighed. "She was my first love." Even though it sounded past tense, Helen felt an unpleasant prick inside. She or her father, the famous professor who had helped you make your way into the world of big science, understood and could feel some sense of gratitude for them, perhaps even some kind of crush. So be it. Don't say that about her. Helen, please. She's only annoyance, shrugged her shoulders. I mean, darling, it's high time you admitted that you're bored with the professor's daughter, the gray mouse. She's my wife, Helen. You're not gonna live with her for the rest of your life, are you? We've talked about this before, but nothing ever came of it. He looked away. Understand. What will happen to us even if I divorce her? I don't have a place of my own. Neither do you. Where will we live? She grinned. It's just a matter of waiting for the right opportunity. What are you talking about? Besides, she continued, you've been wanting to leave this lively university and go into business for a long time, haven't you? You need some initial capital. The girl smiled. Do you love me? Unexpectedly, she asked bluntly. Andrew frowned. You know the answer, don't you? It's not an answer. Well, yes, I do. Then just trust me. The girl smiled slyly. As soon as the right moment comes, we'll have everything. You'll get divorced, we'll get married. The house will be ours too. He sighed and pressed his fingers to his temple. Helen, what are you talking about? Trust me. If we both want to be together, we will be. A month later, Andrew suddenly said, You don't know. I've been thinking a lot lately about my words that I'm constantly working, and that's why we don't have enough time to be together. And suddenly I realized how we could solve this issue. Cindy smiled happily. What do you have in mind, sweetie? I want to hire a live-in assistant. The girl's eyebrows rose in surprise. I'm sorry, what do you mean an assistant? He sighed. I have a girl in mind. She's a student at our institute, a part-time laboratory assistant. I know she needs money badly, and a place to live would be nice. Anyway, I thought that if she could live with us, everything would benefit from it. The girl would have her own place, a small salary. It's a big house, we won't even notice her here. And she can help you with the household chores and me as a secretary. Cindy thought about it. Do you think she'd agree to that? I'm sure Cindy doubted it. It seemed very strange to have a strange girl in their house. But on the other hand, it would give them some free time. All right, Cindy said, bring her in, get to know her, talk to her. If all goes well, let her stay. We do have a big house. Andrew smiled. I always knew you were smart, he said. You won't regret it. Helen, Andrew's student. Cindy really liked a short, okay seeming, very agile and savvy. Of course, I won't say I'm a professional ruler, but I can still do some things. Cindy smiled. You don't need to do all the housework, do you? It's more like doing something periodically when I don't have time. Helen smiled back. I will try to organize everything so that you and I are comfortable. So after a short interview, Helen settled into Cindy's house. She was really quick to organize the order there. Helen carried on as if she was the hostess. She had a real talent for organizing space, time, and place. She started very carefully, almost imperceptibly. Cindy Randolph, I wanted to make a suggestion, Helen said. I suggest we move most of the dishes we don't use to a separate closet in another room. That's a good idea. Helen, come on, why don't we do a little rearranging? At first, Cindy was wary and reluctant to agree to the change. But the further she went, the more she realized that Helen was making her life more convenient. As if that wasn't the only thing she liked, though. Her husband definitely seemed happier, too. He was in a good mood all the time now. At times, he even poked something under his nose. You seem much more awake, Cindy told him one day. He shrugged. Helen's been doing a good job of unloading me. She takes care of most of the chores. All I'm left with is the creative process. That's great. I'm happy for you. My husband smiled back. And I'm glad you said yes. A few months later, Cindy suddenly realized that she felt a restlessness inside. She couldn't explain it to herself. On the contrary, things seemed to be getting better. Her husband became cheerful, happy, had less work. Except that it seemed as if she was gradually becoming superfluous in her own home. As if a lot of events were happening without her participation. She kept trying to calm herself down, but the inner anxiety wouldn't let go. Sometimes she thought Helen and Andrew were talking about something when she thought she couldn't hear, as if they were hiding something. Sometimes she tried talking to her husband about it. What do you talk about all the time? With Helen. What do you mean? What do you mean? But you talk about something all the time. Which he shrugged his shoulders about. Yeah, work stuff. Wait, you're not. I'm only jealous, maybe. Well, now it seemed like the husband was really angry. I invited Helen over for you, to make you feel better, and now you're giving me a hard time. That's impossible. Cindy. Andrew, I'm sorry. I've had enough. I'm going for a walk. They were lying alone on the wide bed. Maybe it's time to get dressed. Not yet. The girl objected languidly. She'll be here in 2 hours. The man sighed. She's definitely suspicious of us by now. That's all right. Everything will be ready soon. He raised himself up on his elbow and looked at her with surprise. What do you mean? She shrugged her shoulders. You'll see. Helen, you scare me sometimes. She turned and looked him in the eye. Do you love me? Yes, put everything on me. That day began at Cindy's as usual. The only thing that confused her was the strange flavor of the tea. The familiar jasmine flavor seemed to be interfered with by a foreign note. Helen must be experimenting with additives again. Melissa mint? No, something unfamiliar. Since she was already late for work, there was no time to find out what the tea tasted like. Cindy tossed the plate into the sink and sprinted outside. It was clearly going to rain, and it was getting sharply colder. Okay, I won't go back for an umbrella. I'm by car anyway, the girl thought. It took her about 30 minutes to get to work, a road she knew well. Drive across the street, drive out of their suburban neighborhood. Drive a little further along the forest, cross the bridges. In 10 minutes, she would be entering the city. As Cindy got behind the wheel, she felt her head start to hurt. Probably a reaction to the change in weather. Okay, she'll get there, and then stop by the drugstore on the way. We have to hurry. She's so late, and it's starting to rain. She drove down a familiar street with difficulty, and at the exit of the neighborhood, she noticed black flies dancing in front of her eyes. What if she passed on his affinity for the disease? Okay, it wouldn't look like a heart attack at all. But what if it was a stroke? How would it even manifest itself? As she drove along the woods, she thought of stopping, getting out of the car, and putting her head in the rain. It seemed to make it easier. Be patient a little longer, she urged herself. It would be faster to get to the center, and there you could go to the pharmacy. The rain had let up, even though the windshield wipers were working at full capacity. It was impossible to see anything further than 15 meters away. And then my head felt like it wanted to split in half. And I'm so weak, nauseous. As she approached the bridge, Cindy felt her neck and arms loosen and let go of the steering wheel. Her head flies forward and presses her forehead into the signal, which makes the car begin to hum pitifully. Her foot pressed the gas pedal by itself, and the car was rushing forward with all its might. The first thing she felt was a terrible pain in her whole body. Cindy felt heavy, clumsy, as if she were shackled from head to toe in ancient knight's armor that she couldn't even turn around in. After a while, she began to remember what had happened to her: the rain, the road, the accident. She had gotten into an accident on her way to work. She tried to open her eyes. The light was very bright. When her eyes got used to it a little, it became clear that she was looking at a high white ceiling. It was a hospital. Cindy tried to turn her head. It didn't work to move the toe of her hand with her foot. It was no use. Her body felt wooden. Oh, Randolph woke up. A pleasant male voice sounded somewhere near her. Up in her field of vision appeared the head of a young guy about 20 years old. Big green eyes, a medical mask, and a white cap. "Can you hear me?" he asked a little worriedly, as Cindy didn't react in any way. Yes, she tried to say, but only what sounded like a long whisper seemed to come out of her mouth. So Cindy Randolph understood. The nurse said in a cheerful voice, "Don't worry, we'll fix it now." He carefully slipped a thin plastic tube between her lips. She squeezed them as hard as she could and sucked her mouth in. It began to fill with cool, fresh water. It felt immediately better. "But how?" asked the boy. "Thank you." In a voice already like her own, Cindy answered, "That's much better. Where am I?" "First City Hospital. Combined Trauma Unit." "Do you remember what happened?" "Yes," Cindy answered in a weak voice. "It was raining and I had an accident with my car." "That's good. Do you remember your name?" "Yeah, actually, you already called Cindy Randolph." "Aha. All right, well, rest up while your doctor comes in." The doctor was a huge man in his 40s. He spoke to Cindy sternly and gently at the same time. Said the accident was serious. Her car had gone off the bridge at high speed and into the river. It's a good thing the depth was shallow, just over a meter. Her car was quickly spotted by a passing driver and an ambulance was called. Cindy was brought to the hospital unconscious and immediately placed on the operating table at the same time as resuscitative measures were being administered. "It's easier for me to tell you what you have intact than to list what is damaged," the doctor said cheerfully. "That doesn't sound like much fun," Cindy said. "I agree," he admitted honestly. "But believe me, it's still very optimistic. You were brought in just as I was on duty. I've been on duty for 20 years. Believe me, that day I was sure you weren't going to make it. Literally one chance in 1 million. You're a lucky man, Cindy," she sighed quietly. "I can't feel anything," the girl admitted. "I can't even turn my head." "That's not good. The doctors are coughing. It's too early to draw any conclusions. Too little time has passed. We'll see how your recovery goes. You make it sound like I'm clearly not doing well." He sighed. "The injuries are serious. We'll just wait for now, and your husband will come to see you soon. In the meantime, get some rest." Cindy thought Andrew looked worried and frightened. "How are you?" he asked. "So-so," Cindy replied. "But it could be worse. Is that what the doctor said?" "Yes," the husband said, a little confused. "It could have been much worse. Do you remember what happened?" She answered vaguely. "I think I lost control of the car. I remember the road was slippery." Yes, the weather was terrible then," hastily said the husband. "No wonder the car skidded like that." Cindy looked at him carefully. He was strangely nervous. "Didn't the doctors tell you anything?" she asked. "They give me all the information in generalities." Andrew sighed. "They didn't explain anything to me either." "What's broken?" "Left forearm, right femur, pelvis. There was a tear in my spleen. But I think it's all sewn up. Some other internal injuries." He stopped talking abruptly. "Is there more?" Cindy asked. No, go ahead. Spinal trauma. What does that mean? He sighed to Cindy. It's too early to draw conclusions. Talk. You may not be able to walk. She cried. It's not certain yet, Cindy. I shouldn't have said that. It was still a very short time after the operation. Cindy spent several months in the hospital. Gradually, she began to turn her head, and then she felt that she could move her fingers, but only weakly. Every movement was painful, and something inside her felt like it was constantly tearing and pulling. Unfortunately, the attending physician told her, "We've done everything we can. I still can't walk quietly," Cindy said. He pressed his lips together and nodded. That means I'll never get back on my feet. With our level of medical advancement, that's still true. Cindy nodded. She had suspected it for a long time. When her husband came in the evening, she talked to him. Andrew listened to her as seriously as possible. I've already thought about it, he said. There is one option. What? Cindy asked in astonishment. There is a clinic in Germany. I've contacted them. What do you mean? There's a doctor there. He's worked with patients with injuries just like yours. And he's gotten a lot of people back on their feet. He has. Yeah, it's for a fee. Andrew sighed yes, I've been quoted a fee. Cindy clapped excitedly, we'll make it if we sell your house. The house? Yes, Cindy, okay, she said. I'll do it. He sighed, I've already found a buyer. How about that? I'm sorry, there's not a lot of time. I understand and I'm not judging. I just need you to sign the papers transferring ownership to me. Otherwise, I can't close the deal. Of course I'll sign. Finally, after months of darkness, she had a glimmer of hope. Time dragged on slowly. Cindy waited and waited and waited. Andrew stopped coming, saying he had to deal with selling the house and processing her transfer to Germany. And then he didn't call her all day. Cindy got worried, called herself. The phone was disconnected. She asked the nursing staff if anyone had contacted her husband. Cindy was brought to the hospital unconscious and immediately placed on the operating table at the same time as resuscitative measures were being administered. It's easier for me to tell you what you have intact than to list what is damaged. The doctor said cheerfully. That doesn't sound like much fun, Cindy said. I agree. He admitted honestly. But believe me, it's still very optimistic. You were brought in just as I was on duty. I've been on duty for 20 years. Believe me, that day I was sure you weren't going to make it. Literally 1 chance in 1 million. You're a lucky man, Cindy, she sighed quietly. I can't feel anything, the girl admitted. I can't even turn my head. That's not good. The doctors are coughing. It's too early to draw any conclusions. Too little time has passed. We'll see how your recovery goes. You make it sound like I'm clearly not doing well. He sighed. The injuries are serious. We'll just wait for now, and your husband will come to see you soon. In the meantime, get some rest. Cindy thought Andrew looked worried and frightened. How are you? He asked. So, Cindy replied. But it could be worse. Is that what the doctor said? Yes, the husband said, a little confused. It could have been much worse. Do you remember what happened? She answered vaguely. I think I lost control of the car. I remember the road was slippery. Yes, the weather was terrible then, hastily said the husband. No wonder the car skidded like that. Cindy looked at him carefully. He was strangely nervous. Didn't the doctors tell you anything? She asked. They give me all the information in generalities. Andrew sighed. They didn't explain anything to me either. What's broken? Left forearm, right femur, pelvis. There was a tear in my spleen. But I think it's all summed up. Some other internal injuries. He stopped talking abruptly. Is there more? Cindy asked. No, go ahead. Spinal trauma. What does that mean? He sighed to Cindy. It's too early to draw conclusions. Talk. You may not be able to walk. She cried. It's not certain yet, Cindy. I shouldn't have said that. It was still a very short time after the operation. Cindy spent several months in the hospital. Gradually, she began to turn her head, and then she felt that she could move her fingers, but only weakly. Every movement was painful, and something inside her felt like it was constantly tearing and pulling. Unfortunately, the attending physician told her, "We've done everything we can. I still can't walk quietly," Cindy said. He pressed his lips together and nodded. "That means I'll never get back on my feet." With our level of medical advancement, that's still true. Cindy nodded. She had suspected it for a long time. When her husband came in the evening, she talked to him. Andrew listened to her as seriously as possible. "I've already thought about it," he said. "There is one option." "What?" Cindy asked in astonishment. "There is a clinic in Germany. I've contacted them." "What do you mean?" "There's a doctor there. He's worked with patients with injuries just like yours. And he's gotten a lot of people back on their feet. He has." "Yeah, it's for a fee." Andrew sighed. "Yes, I've been quoted a fee." Cindy clapped excitedly. "We'll make it if we sell your house." "The house?" "Yes, Cindy. Okay," she said. "I'll do it." He sighed. "I've already found a buyer." "How about that?" "I'm sorry. There's not a lot of time." "I understand, and I'm not judging. I just need you to sign the papers transferring ownership to me. Otherwise, I can't close the deal." "Of course I'll sign." Finally, after months of darkness, she had a glimmer of hope. Time dragged on slowly. Cindy waited and waited and waited. Andrew stopped coming, saying he had to deal with selling the house and processing her transfer to Germany. And then he didn't call her all day. Cindy got worried, called herself. The phone was disconnected. She asked the nursing staff if anyone had contacted her husband. No, she was supposed to be discharged in a couple days. Cindy didn't know what to think. After thinking about it, she called Helen. Her phone was disconnected too, so she called the institute. They told her that Andrew had written a letter of resignation a few days ago. No one had seen him after that. Cindy could not understand what was going on, why he stopped contacting her, what had happened to him, and where Helen had gone. "Cindy Randolph," the nurse said timidly, "I hate to say it, but we have to discharge you tomorrow. Unfortunately, all the time allowed for you to stay in the hospital has passed. Maybe someone other than your husband can take you away. You will come for me tomorrow." Cindy answered firmly, but she didn't really feel that certainty anymore. It was as if the stupor that had come over her after her father's death had returned to her. It was as if she were in a fog, moving around the room on the gurney, gathering her things. Some part of her clearly realized that her husband would not come for her tomorrow, and another part was willing to hope against all odds. "Cindy Randolph, wake up." She was gently touched on the shoulder by a familiar nurse. Cindy opened her eyes with difficulty. She hadn't been able to sleep for a long time last night. "What happened? Did someone come for you?" Cindy gasped. "I'm ready," she said. The guy smiled. "Are your papers still being signed?" "Take your time. There is time." She tried to pack as quickly as possible. Yesterday she was so worried, so angry with her husband. He must have been delayed arranging her flight to Germany. In fact, there was no telling what kind of paperwork was needed there. She was helped down the hall. Her bag was placed on her lap. "Did we give you your papers yet?" They told her. "Just give me a minute." "Have a good day." Cindy Randolph. She stayed in the lobby. "But where's Andrew?" "Hello, granddaughter." Suddenly a low male voice sounded beside her. Cindy looked up in surprise. A large, tall, elderly man towered over her. "I'm sorry," Cindy said. "I think you have me confused with someone else." He grinned, and Cindy suddenly thought that he looked like her father, only older by about 20 or 30 years. If the old man answered, then he put the bag of documents on her lap, walked resolutely around the chair, took hold of the handles, and rolled her towards the exit. "What are you doing?" Cindy screamed. "Where are you taking me?" "To the car. I'm waiting for my husband. He's supposed to pick me up." "Come on," the man said dryly. "How long has it been since you last spoke to him?" Cindy pressed her lips together a few days ago. "Do you know what's wrong with him?" "I assume he drove her up to an ancient white UAZIK and unexpectedly, deftly, for a man of his years, moved her into the front seat." "Are you visiting me?" Cindy asked. "Is this for ransom?" "Someone needs me," the old man said gruffly, but without malice. "So who are you? And what about my husband?" He just sighed, loaded the stroller into the trunk, threw the bag on the back seat, walked around the car, and sat in the driver's seat. "Who are you?" Cindy repeated. "Your grandfather? That you were my father's father." But Cindy tried to remember everything she knew about her father and grandfather's relationship. "It's not like you two haven't talked your whole lives. How did you even know about me? I've never seen you once in my life." The old man suddenly sighed and looked at her carefully. "But you are more like me than it seemed at first glance. Do you have the tenacity, strength, and fortitude that your grandfather had?" "You have not answered the question," Cindy repeated stubbornly. He grinned. "Stephen wrote me a letter 6 months before he died. I didn't answer him then, but I honored his request." "What request?" "To keep an eye on you and help you wherever possible. As long as you were doing better or worse, I didn't interfere. You could have managed on your own, but now you're a granddaughter, in full, I'm sorry. Is that any other word you were expecting? Okay, so you know what happened to my husband in general terms after you transferred the rights to my father's house to him. He sold it and also took all the money out of your joint account, quit his job, and took off into the sunset with his mistress. Yeah, with a new one." Cindy nodded slowly. The fog was floating in her head again. "And I don't believe any of this is really happening." Grandpa sighed. "Well, as long as we're on the road, you'll have plenty of time to get your head around it," he muttered. "Where are we going?" "To my village, to your father's hometown." She didn't remember when she fell asleep. Big, strong arms carried her gently into the house and laid her on the wide bed. She slept soundly that night. The sleeplessness, anxiety, and fatigue of the previous days must have taken their toll. Cindy awoke quite late. The sun was already shining and birds were singing outside the open wooden window. At first, she didn't even realize where she was. And then the thoughts came all at once. Her husband's betrayal. Helen's assistant, who turned out to be his mistress, the loss of her house and all her money, and most importantly, the loss of hope that she would be operated on and be able to walk on her own. Cindy was about to develop when suddenly the voice of Grandpa O, awake at last, and "You. Good morning, Grandpa Stephen." "What a morning. It's daytime. Come on, get up to wash up." In response to his rudeness, she also wanted to answer sharply, "I don't go. If you forget, I remember everything." He answered calmly, "But don't think you'll be lying there staring at the ceiling all the time. You have to learn to maximize your self-care. Your first task is to get into the chair on your own. If you can't, you'll just stay here." "What? I don't have time for you. I've got things to do." After that, the grandfather left with determination. Cindy tried to get out of bed. While the girl was in the hospital, there were always nursing staff around to help. There were also various straps and handrails in the ward, so that it was possible to move around. And now she had been trying for perhaps half an hour, her face and back covered. Then Cindy was shaking from the effort, but the lower half of her body felt heavy and alien, as if bags of cement had been tied to it. When Stephen's grandfather returned, she was crying softly with her face buried in the pillow. "Yes, very much so. Like he said, we won't get far this way." He took her in his arms, transferred her to a chair, and rolled her outside. There he rolled the chair up to that ancient aluminum washstand against the fence. Judging by the fact that it was attached at the height of Cindy's chair, her grandfather had installed it especially for her. On the lid were a bar of soap and a new toothbrush. After Cindy had cleaned herself up, Grandpa said, "I'm not going to take you for a ride. You need to exercise your arms. Come with me." He walked towards the big garden, and Cindy had no choice but to follow him. At the hospital, she had only ridden on the smooth floor of the corridor, and that took effort. Here on the ground and grass, it was triple the effort. But realizing that her grandfather would not help her anymore, she clenched her teeth and began to spin the wheels with zeal. By the time she got to the table, she was exhausted, her hands were shaking, and sticky streams of sweat ran down her back. "I don't know what I'm used to in the city. Our food here is simple oatmeal with milk, 2 boiled eggs and tea. You gotta eat it all." She didn't mind. After breakfast, Cindy decided it was time to talk. "So now I'm going to be staying with you somewhere." He seemed to flinch at the unfamiliar address. "I don't think you have any other options. What happened with you and Dad? Why haven't you two talked in so many years?" "I don't want to talk about it." Cindy's grandfather frowned. You're my only relative, and I only saw you for the first time in my life now that I've lost my father, my husband, my house, all my money, and become an invalid. I wish I had some clarity in this life. Stephen shifted his bushy eyebrows and looked at his granddaughter carefully. She didn't look away. I was right after all, he said. Didn't you think so? You have our character, Randolph. It's a good thing you didn't change your name after marriage. Cindy shrugged. Daddy asked me to. And Andrew did whatever his favorite professor said. And I like our last name. Okay, nodded the grandfather. I'll tell you everything. Actually, the story will not be very long. Your father was not like me at all. You see, I'm a simple countryman, and he was always out of this world. He was fiddling with his little bundles instead of climbing on roofs and lighting fires with the boys. Sitting in the library, reading books. He always looked down on me and my mother as if we were a village, and he was a white bone who was thrown to us by mistake by another breed. Was that why you didn't like him? Cindy asked. Grandfather frowned. Yes, I did love him. An only child just didn't breed all that callow tenderness after all. Cindy remembered how her father had always been attentive and affectionate, how he had sat with her 24 hours a day when she was sick, how he had read her fairy tales and lost her wet sponge, how he had made sweet morsels himself, how he had taught her to ride a bicycle, how he had sat in the front row at all her school performances, how they had gone to the ice cream parlor at the end of each quarter. How much he must have missed that in his interactions with his own father. You're a very cold grandfather, Stepa, she said calmly. It's good that Dad didn't go into you. Grandfather grinned. Your father left us as soon as the opportunity arose. Yes, I can understand not having the warmest relationship with him, but I won't forgive him for your grandmother's mother. What happened to my grandmother? She loved him very much, longed for him. And when he left, I waited for letters, waited for him to come. But he forgot about us. Of course, he's in the city now. There he realized his dream, showed everyone how smart he is. Any other parent would be proud of a son like that. But you judged him and never supported him. Any other son would have respected his parents, Stephen argued. He was returning the favor you gave him. You don't know how we communicated. You haven't seen him in decades. I know him better than you do. The children, the granddaughter, looked at each other, glaring. He's the reason my wife, your grandmother, died. You're lying. She protected me from longing for him. I wrote him letters, begging him, one might even say, begging him to come. But he answered rarely and dryly, saying he had no time, work, studies. And then it was too late. She died. Dad said he went to her funeral. Yes, he came when there was nothing to be done. Did you have a big fight there? Yeah, I told him what I thought of him as a son. Said if it wasn't for him, maybe his mother would have lived longer. Some cruel grandfather. He said she died from living with me. That's when we stopped talking. The grandfather stopped talking. It was as if Cindy saw in his eyes an echo of past events. He was absorbed in memories of the past and had forgotten that she was sitting next to him. Did either of you try to make up afterward? No. I didn't know anything about him getting married, you being born. I used to think I never had a son. But you said he wrote to you? Yes. Shortly before he died, a huge, long letter telling me everything. That he had a wife who had died, that he had a grown daughter who had married, but also about himself, of course, that he was ill and could die at any moment. He asked me to look after me. Cindy felt tears about to roll from her eyes. How desperate was her father to turn to the man they hated so much. Somehow he looked out for me, kept an eye on me. Grandfather grinned. Well, sort of. I have students, former colleagues. They work in different fields now. Some of them have influential acquaintances. I asked them to find out how your life is going. And what did you find out? Stephen sighed. I didn't like your husband right away. Slippery, even though he pretended to be good for so many years. Hell in that. But you didn't interfere. Why should I? The old man shrugged. You, a grown-up girl, should sort out your own life. But now you've interfered. Yes, you decided you couldn't do it without me. Cindy lowered her eyes. What are we going to do next? But I'm personally going to get you back to normal. Which is what? Who and where you can look after yourself and preferably walk. Not hang on my neck, anyway. Cindy, grinned the grandfather bitterly. It's impossible, she muttered. The doctors said it was my maximum. Andrew said there was a chance of an operation in Germany, but now I think he made it up. Grandpa nodded. Okay, let's say. What do you want to do? Live in Grandpa's house in the village. How long? A year, 2 years. You're still very young. Is that really how you want to spend your life? Tears rolled down Cindy's face. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. I'll get you back on your feet. You're out of your mind. It's impossible. As long as you say that, it will be, Stephen said calmly. I've been doing this for years. What do I do to heal people? You're the village healer. Well, you can call it that. I'm an experienced man. I have many apprentices. I met one of them today. He will work with you under my supervision, of course. Stephen's apprentice's name was William. He was a young, tall guy, as strong and powerful as Cindy's grandfather. He seemed a little embarrassed by Cindy, looking at her with his big blue eyes a little frightened. You know what to do, said Stephen to the apprentice. He nodded and took Cindy deeper into the garden. There he spread a large blanket on the grass and helped her climb over. Let's start with a massage, he said a little worriedly. His large hands proved to be strong but gentle. He gently applied every muscle, every inch of her body. It hurts, Cindy said. He nodded. I'm sorry, but the pain is with you for a long time now. It's good that sensitivity has been preserved. Okay, if it helps, I'll bear with it. Hang in there, Cindy. The next few months were hell for her. Grandpa Stephen was ruthless. He wouldn't let her rest. Yes, you can't work now, but you have to help me. You've been in hospital for so many months. They were up at 600 now. Cindy moved to the chair, went to wash up outside, then helped her grandfather prepare breakfast. Tut was already by this time coming back from a run and exercise. The first time she constantly burned against the stove was not very convenient to cook sitting down. But Grandpa Stephen kept insisting that she take over that duty. To fry eggs. It's not like chopping a cartload of firewood. So don't complain. I don't demand more of you than you can fulfill. Cindy stubbornly pressed her lips together, treated the burns, and continued to master cooking in her new uncomfortable position. In time, she noticed that it was easier to move around in the chair, her arms getting used to the strain. After breakfast, William came in. He and Cindy started their mornings with a massage that made their whole bodies burn. The massage was usually followed by exercises. Cindy worked her arms, her back, her chest. She tried working her legs too. She didn't feel them for a long time. Only 3 months later, during one of her workouts, her big toe suddenly twitched. Did you see that? Cindy shouted and grabbed William by the shoulder. He saw that her pupils had dilated, and now her normally green eyes seemed almost black. Sorry, Cindy, I didn't see it. With a trembling hand, she pointed to her foot with the big toe of her right foot. It moved. Did you see it now? I see it. That's good. Say don't be silent. That's good. William. It burst. He was ready to dance for joy himself now. You're doing a great job, he said gently. But you realize this is not the end of the road. There's more work to be done. Don't you agree? Cindy exclaimed eagerly. Now I'm sure I can do it all. I can do it. Her cheeks burned with excitement, and she suddenly laughed. For the first time in months, Grandpa Stephen didn't waste any time either. Sometimes Cindy wondered if he was anything like the average pensioner in the countryside. Not only that in his years he could give a head start to any young guy in terms of strength and agility, but he was constantly disappearing somewhere. He had a cell phone, which often someone called. Grandpa Stephen always answered and left the house without a word. Or if he and Cindy were doing something outside at the time, he'd walk away. Who are you always talking to? She asked. I guess so. I don't give you enough to do. If you have the energy to think about my business, from tomorrow you'll have to do the laundry by hand. No, there's Cindy, but the hardest part will be hanging. You've got practiced hands. I didn't take Cindy for curiosity anymore. Are you still keeping tabs on Andrew and Helen? She asked her grandfather once. No, the man replied. I know they've moved somewhere else, but I don't have any more information. Sometimes Cindy thought that the old man didn't tell her much about his past. But how could she know the truth if he didn't say anything? As William had promised, after Cindy moved her fingers for the first time, they had more work to do. Grandfather rejoiced at the news about the motor process and rearranged the training program. Even though Cindy realized he was doing everything he could to get her back on her feet, periodically she literally hated him. Stephen didn't understand words like pity and mercy. Sometimes she thought she saw something like sympathy in William's eyes, but she had never seen it in her grandfather's. It was as if he were transferring to his granddaughter all the pain and resentment he felt for her father. One day, in one of her rare moments of rest, Cindy decided to talk to William. "Tell me about yourself," she asked. "What exactly are you interested in, Maria? Let's just use the first name." "Well, just you. And then call me by your first name too." "Okay. How come you're my grandfather's apprentice, and what are you doing here?" "You're no ordinary country boy." William laughed. "That's what you think of me. All right, I'll tell you my story. I'm excited." He smiled again, and Cindy wondered how cute he was. When they're just talking like that, you guessed it. "I grew up in the city. We have a big family. We have 2 older brothers and 3 younger sisters." "Wow. Yeah, my mom raised the kids, supported us all. My dad worked day and night. What's he like?" "He knows all about building houses. If you ever see our house, you'll go crazy. We invite you to visit." He nodded seriously. "When I was 10 years old, my father had an accident at the construction site. He fell from a great height. There was almost no chance that he would survive. But the doctors worked a miracle. My father was in the hospital for almost 6 months. He came out skinny, almost like a skeleton. He couldn't walk either." Cindy guessed, "Like me?" William smiled weakly. He couldn't feel anything below the neck at all, and he couldn't move. Mom had seen every doctor in town. Surgeons, traumatologists, neurosurgeons, chiropractors, neurologists, all of them just waved their hands. The guy sighed and looked off into the distance. "And then someone told us about Stephen's grandfather. My father was very skeptical, but my mother was ready to try everything. Anyway, they found the machine, came here, and he took it." William nodded. "Yes, he looked at it, touched it, said leave him and one of the boys to help me. For 3 months that boy was you. What you are. And what did you do all that time?" "I mostly helped around the house and watched Stephen. He was always talking to his father about something, changing his massages, vomiting, giving him herbs. I never left his side." "And what?" William smiled. "My father is finishing a house for my sister and her husband." "You mean it's all thanks to my grandfather?" "Yeah, I saw it then and decided I wanted to be serious like that. I was so impressed when I was 10. Cindy, I realize you have a personal vendetta against him because of your father. But can't you see he's a genius? Look at your progress." She sighed and wiggled her toes. "Okay, I got you. I admit it. My grandfather is a fruitcake, but I can see the result. Anyway, I lived the life of an ordinary teenager, but I never lost touch with Stephen. I wrote him letters, he wrote back, and I tried to visit him every summer for a week or even a month." Cindy nodded. So this was who had replaced her grandfather, both son and grandson. "How did you become his student?" "I went to medical school, trained as a nurse, worked in a hospital. It was all good, of course, but I realized I wanted something more. So I came to Stephen, applied to be an apprentice, and I'm in my 3rd year now." "Wow. Does he have any other apprentices?" "Not that I know of." "Why doesn't he open his own school if he's such a magician?" William smiled. "Why don't you ask him all these questions?" Cindy rolled her eyes as if you don't know why. "Okay," William said, "I can't answer for Stephen, so this will just be my guess. I guess he just doesn't have time for other students. And what is it that he's so busy doing?" William poked. "I don't know exactly. He doesn't report to me, but he's away from time to time. Maybe they're treating someone else." William shrugged. "Maybe they do. Maybe something else. I'm even more interested now." Grandfather was becoming more and more mysterious. I never wanted to follow him. I don't like to pry. I'm sorry if I was too intrusive today. I wasn't." William reassured her. "On the contrary, It's nice that you finally paid attention to me. Cindy blushed. I'm sorry. We spend so much time together. It's probably high time I knew more about you. He shrugged. Come on, I'm just sort of your doctor. No doctor would have put so much effort into getting me back on my feet, she argued. And how many of my complaints have you listened to? Whining, crying, tantrums? Terrible. Now I remember, and I'm ashamed of myself. I guess you're the kind of people who are disappointed in their work. William looked her carefully in the eye. Cindy, you are the strongest and bravest person I know. I'm sometimes amazed at how so much strength and character can fit into such a small, fragile girl. Noticing her skeptical look, he added, I'm serious. You never set your mind, and without backing down, you do through the pain. Finish every task, no matter how hard it is for you. You've made a huge difference. Cindy smiled sadly. I guess putting up with it and doing what my only talents tell me to do. And also turning a blind eye to the secrets of the men around me. I take it we're going to learn a little about you now. Sorry, I got carried away. No, go on. I'm very interested. Really, he nodded. Of course you are. You're not the only one who wants to know more about the man you spend so much time with. Cindy looked at him incredulously and asked grandfather, hadn't I told you in general terms that I had a husband who cheated and stole from me? Running off with a mistress I thought was almost a friend, but something like that. But maybe you have your own version? No, it's pretty much the same thing. All I can say is that what happened was my fault. I was growing my dad's flower, which lives in a greenhouse, protecting mine from the slightest temperature fluctuations. And when Daddy was gone, I didn't know how to live. This life was completely dependent on my father, then on my husband. Now my grandfather. It's a weird trend. Well, it's only temporary. You think so? I'm sure. William nodded. Have you thought about how you'll live when you become? Cindy shrugged. To be honest, when we first started practicing, I didn't believe in it. In being able to walk, yes. Do you believe it now? I do. But I haven't thought about the future yet. I've got nothing, no job, no place to live, no money. I live here at the mercy of my grandfather. Think about the future, Cindy. It's time. After talking to William, Cindy began to think about her life. She was actually getting stronger and stronger. Every day her muscles were obeying her more and more. The day came when she was able to get out of her chair and start walking. At first, it was just a little bit of walking. So that's what you're pumping my arms and back like that for, said Cindy, resting all her weight on the metal handles. How long do I have to wait for you? Cindy said, glowering at her grandfather. Cindy smiled. His sarcasm and cynicism hadn't hurt her so much lately. Were you going somewhere today? She asked. None of your business. I asked if you were going into town. Cindy asked. I need to do some shopping there. Wow, he never admitted whether he went to town or not. That's clever, Grandpa. I can't say. So Stephen continued. Take William, go and get what you need. Cindy blushed. I'm on the move as fast as I can move, and I can barely move. So what? Is everyone going to stare at me? The grandfather sighed, rolled his eyes, walked over to his granddaughter and looked at her. Seriously, Cindy, are you still interested in other people's opinions? You've come such a long way in a few months from a helpless vegetable to practically standing on your own 2 feet, and you're thinking about someone looking at you sideways. Cindy, you had your shoulders back and looked your grandfather straight in the eye. Thank you. Suddenly she said, You're right. I don't care how anyone looks at me. He nodded with satisfaction. That's where I'll recognize the Romanov breed. Good idea about the city. It's about time you had a break, and tea with 2 men. Will likes the idea too. Really, why didn't I think of that? You should try your hand in a city setting. It was a long drive into town, and all the while Cindy was filled with a strange excitement. Where are we going? William asked her. Well, first we'll stop at a pawn shop. Wow, you're going to rob? No, I need to sell something to make some money. William coughed embarrassingly. Actually, Stephen has earmarked the money for your expenses. Cindy smiled. That's nice of him, but I have my own. Take it to the pawn shop. She refused to let him go with her. It was scary and hard to get out of the car by herself, and slowly breast the street, shifting the walker in front of her. But at that moment, Cindy suddenly remembered her father, how he, a mere boy, had come from the countryside to the city at 17 and entered the university to become the youngest professor. And she just needed to take a few steps, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by, and hand over her earrings to a pawn shop. By the way, it turned out to be not so difficult. She even seemed to be lucky. The seller looked at her with some sympathy and offered more for the earrings than she had bargained for. But the transaction went well. William asked when she got back into the car. Cindy nodded cheerfully. More than that. Where to now? Anywhere. Where can I buy a laptop? I also have a question. Does our village have internet? Of course we do, but great. Then we're definitely buying a laptop. Cindy was quick. I needed a simple but reliable model. Tell us what you want from it and we'll pick it up, the salesman asked. I don't have a lot of requirements, Cindy replied. I wanted to have good network reception. I'll also be typing on it. Maybe I'll use it for video conferencing. That's about it. Well, then you'll be fine with this one. Then he and Vovo went to a few more places. There's a group of vitamins that are hard to get from food. And you need to recover now, so we'll buy them. I have money now. I want to pay for it myself. William shook his head. I got a serious instruction on that from your grandfather. He said until you start earning money, you can't take money from him under any circumstances. All right, I'll talk to him. The young men drove back in silence. But already near the house, William asked, what were you doing with the laptop? Cindy smiled slyly. Let it be my secret for now. What do you say? Re-entering the social world was like learning to walk all over again. She seemed to be making progress. She's been getting pretty handy with the walker. And in the last week, she started to move on her own, but not for long distances, holding on to furniture, but still. Soon you'll start running, said Grandpa Stephen. Your legs are like matchsticks. Thank you for the compliment, replied the granddaughter. Only such cans as you have. I also do not want. Grandfather lifted his leg, looking at his caviar. You for a lifetime and half of them, so do not pump them up. Along with learning to walk, Cindy began to relearn those very social skills. She texted the girl she socialized with the most at her old job. Tanya immediately suggested a call. Oh, Cindy, it's been a long time. It's been a long time. Costs. It cost Cindy to pick up the phone. We all went crazy when you disappeared. Then word got out about the accident, that you almost died. Cindy smiled sadly. It had been a while. But I'm recovering now. Yeah, Tanya continued. And then I didn't hear from you at all. So you probably don't know anything about me either? I don't know. I left the school where we worked and now I'm self-employed. I started my own online school. And it's not wrong to say you called me for a reason. You guessed it, Cindy said. I'm in the midst of a bit of a recovery and I want to get back to work. So far, unfortunately, I'm only going to be able to get it removed. Maybe you have some ideas. I do. I'm just short on people, especially with your skills. And by the way, a remote format would be fine. You think I can handle that? Of course you do. You were our best. Thank you, Tanya. That was very important to hear. The girls talked for almost another hour and finally came to an agreement. The following week, Cindy started work. Mind you, Stephen told his granddaughter, your work does not exempt you from training. Of course it does, grandfather, of course it does. Stephen glared, but didn't say anything. I can rearrange my schedule to make it convenient for Cindy to work, said William, who was having lunch with them at that moment. Do I mind? Just keep busy. Do you like shoveling snow? Cindy asked William. What? He looked up. His cheeks were drooping, his hair sticking out from under his hat, sticking to his temple. Cindy even stopped working for love for a while. How coherently and easily he swung the shovel, clearing the path to the house. Do you like shoveling snow? The girl repeated. William shrugged his shoulders. Well, it's a great workload. And it's not just for me. By the way, it's good for you too. And Stephen gave a clear assignment that by the time he arrived, all the snow should be cleared. Okay, sighed Cindy. In honor of the coming new year, I won't argue with you. Grandpa returned after lunch, as usual, without saying a word about where he had been or what he had been doing. But we'll have guests with lots of bags. Cindy asked in surprise. No, of course not. What a question. Then why is there enough food for a whole company? Cindy looked through the contents of the bag, and her amazement grew. Grandpa, did you rob a deli? Champagne, pineapple, red caviar, trout, 4 kinds of cheese, turkey. That's enough for 3 of us for a month. Give me a break, woman, I brought it all. Your job is to unpack and set the table and keep your mouth shut. William was already doing that. After all, he'd known the teacher for years. Is the bathhouse ready? Yes, Stephen? Right, I'm off. You two get on with your business. Cindy and William started setting the table. Where did he get all that money? Cindy asked. It's like 4 average people's pensions. I don't know, but I'm sure it has something to do with his absences. He probably kills to order, Cindy said thoughtfully. I don't have any other theories yet. William laughed. I'm sure it's legitimate. But you'd better ask him yourself. I think I'll hold off. He'll make me run circles around the house until New Year's Eve. By the time Grandpa came back from the bath, the table was already set. Why isn't the TV on yet? Stephen asked harshly. Cindy obediently reached for the remote control to turn on a movie. Who needs it? Cindy raised her eyebrows in surprise. At least she and her grandfather were on the same page. What do you want then? We have a subscription to 3 theaters. Pick a good movie. What do you say, Grandpa? It was strange to sit at the table with people she didn't even know a year ago. As a child, she always celebrated this holiday with her father, then with her father and her husband, then only with her husband. And now it was Grandpa Stephen, stern and mysterious, who either despised her or hated her, and William Cindy looked at him intently. He was watching a movie passionately, and a piece of red fish was frozen on his fork. Cindy smiled. She liked it so much that he had this tremendous strength and a childlike enthusiasm and spontaneity about him. Sometimes she caught herself thinking that she liked William very much. Then she began to wonder if he liked her. And then she scolded herself for thinking that. Had she not been burned enough, why seek new adventures? Or maybe it shows that she cannot live alone without a man? Maybe she's so weak that she needs someone to be there for her. Well, suddenly Grandpa interrupted the silence. It's time for the toasts, and I'll begin. Cindy and William looked at him in surprise. Stephen nonchalantly continued, This has been an unusual year for me. I'm not prone to sentimentality, but it was nice to meet my own granddaughter. He looked Cindy straight in the eye. You are an amazing girl. When I praise you, which I rarely do, I only mention that you have our blood in you. Randolph. However, I'm not always the stubborn old fool I try to appear to be. I see that my son has brought you up beautifully. At this point, the girl suddenly thought that the old man's eyes glistened. I know that he and I have both been terribly foolish and have let resentment get the better of us for too many years. I'm grateful to your father for taking the first step in writing me that letter. I wish I had never made up my mind to see my son while he was still alive. But it's better late to admit your mistakes than never. Grandfather. Cindy stood up, walked over, and hugged him tightly. Grandfather smelled of birch leaves and grass. May you be embarrassed, he replied, but he hugged her back too. Cindy even thought he kissed her on the top of her head. After a few seconds, Stephen gently pulled away and sat up. I'm very happy to have you in my life, Cindy, and I want you to know that you can stay in my house as long as you want. Thank you, Grandpa. Cindy stood up, champagne glass in hand. Since it's time for a toast, it's logical for me to say something in return. I won't be original. If I remind you that you saved my life and gave me the strength and sense to go on living. You are my nearest and dearest people now. Without you, I would definitely be dead or dying now on the street or in some hospice. The man at the table frowned. Cindy smiled. Thanks to you, I'm happier than I've ever been in my life. I like practicing. I like listening to Grandpa Stepa's jokes. I felt good today just sitting with Vova and setting the table. They had a drink, then William stood up. Well, now me. I guess, compared to you, I've probably had the least changes. I haven't made any new relatives, but I hope I've made a good friend. He looked at Cindy. I'm grateful for your kind words. I hope your life will only get better from here. "But that's enough snot," shouted the grandfather. "Happy New Year! Happy New Year! Happy New Year!" Then they went outside. William and Stephen set up a huge firecracker in the snow and lit it. Tall columns of red, yellow, green, blue, and white sparks flew out of it. Cindy looked at them, smiled, and thought what an amazing future awaited her with these amazing people. But how long will it be? Andrew sighed how he hated his wife's voice. How could he have liked her before? Though perhaps it was the tone of voice she used to speak to Helen and look at him differently. And she used to speak in a languid, breathy way. Now she was always dissatisfied with everything. And it always seemed like the more he gave her, the more she asked for. They'd gotten good money for the sale of the professor's house, plus what was in the bank account. He invested it all in the business. Things were going well. Shortly after the wedding, she and Helen moved into the apartment they had just bought. It was in the most expensive and fashionable area of the city, with a new renovation. Helen was as excited as a child at the time. "Kodak, look at the view from the window." He smiled, nodded, looked at her condescendingly. "Baby, this is just the beginning." "What are the ceilings like?" "Kitty." Helen laughed, ran up to him, kissed him. He grabbed her and surrounded her. "What are you doing?" "Stop it." Yes, they had a very good time at first. Of course, sometimes he thought about Cindy. Then he'd get a little tight inside. Where is she? What's wrong with her? Maybe she's still in the hospital. No, I don't think so. But she's got no one and nothing. No home, no money, no relatives. What do you think is wrong with Cindy now? He asked Lena once. She shrugged her shoulders. She's probably in some hospice. Maybe she even caught pneumonia and died there. Andrew looked at her face. His wife looked completely calm. Don't you feel sorry for her? Helen poked and looked at him with surprise. What is it suddenly with you? You knew everything from the beginning, and you agreed to it yourself. Andrew shrugged awkwardly. Well, yes, I just don't know. I can imagine how she is now without everything. It's her own fault. Helen cut him off harshly. You can't be like that. Knave fools. She suddenly sat up on the bed, took her husband by the chin, forcing him to look into Kodak's eyes. There are two kinds of people in the world. Those like her, everything comes easy and simple. And those like you and me have to fight for everything. And that's just justice. Yeah, you're right. He tried not to think about his ex-wife. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Focused on business. Money was a distraction, but not for long. New car, expensive watches, suits. He rejoiced in it, but the euphoria grew shorter and shorter after each purchase. Then he began to notice the same with his wife. At first, she was pleased with the gifts. She came from a poor family. Helen's only values were youth, beauty, and adaptability. The rest she received at the expense of his money status, new rich girlfriend's pleasure. Sometimes Andrew even pitied her. At some moments in her broke through this poor, not before affectionate girl from the province who desperately wanted a good life. In him it caused both pity and rejection. In general, she began to irritate him often. Always dissatisfied, always wanting something more. But as if she did not know what to fill the inner void. Lately we've become strangers to each other, Andrew said to wife. She only poked at him contemptuously. Is there something you want to say? Andrew drained himself, but answered maybe we should get a divorce. She turned sharply toward him. It was as if her eyes even lit up. Did you have someone else? No, of course not. What makes you think that? Look at me. She jumped up, walked over to him, and looked him in the eye with hatred. Try to talk about divorce again, and I'll have you sitting on your ass. Helen smiled evilly. You think your wife just had an accident for no reason. He turned pale. It was raining, the road was slippery. And there's a dangerous section on the bridge, he muttered. Helen laughed. How like a witch was she at that moment? Evil, ugly, and very dangerous. Don't lie to me, and above all, don't lie to yourself. You've always known that this accident wasn't just an accident, and believe me, I can prove that you set it up. The expression on her face changed dramatically. Big round eyes, implied lips. She seemed about to cry. Now she reminded him of that young girl he'd fallen in love with years ago. I swear I knew nothing. Helen said in a trembling voice. I was so young then, stupid. I fell madly in love with him. Andrew offered to live in his house as an assistant so we could spend more time together. Her long, fluffy eyelashes fluttered, and small, shiny tears rolled down her cheeks. He promised he'd tell Cindy Randolph and divorce her soon. And then she began to guess something. Soon there was this terrible accident. I never thought my lover had anything to do with it. So the Helen actress poked and then continued in the same pitiful voice. And then he said we had to leave. He had money from somewhere. I asked about Cindy. He said she'd agreed to the divorce and had gone to Germany. No one's gonna believe you weren't involved. Yes, they will. I'll say I've only started to figure it out lately, but you threatened me, so I kept quiet. He approached her, raised his hand as if he wanted to hit her. His wife looked at him defiantly, but she shouted, "Come on, do it. Give me a reason to file a police report on you." Andrew then restrained himself with great difficulty, clenched his hands into fists, turned around and jumped out of the house. He got into the car and drove for a long time until he got to a quiet street. I shut the car off and closed my eyes. What had I done? How could I have been so blind? Now she's gonna blackmail me for the rest of my life. No matter how hard Andrew tried to solve the problem, he came up with nothing. He decided to leave it alone. The longer it went on, the less he and his wife tried to communicate. Mostly he just gave her money. He occupied himself with work and meetings with new rich friends, though they were hardly his friends, just business partners. Sometimes he remembered his teacher, W. Stephen. There was always some honesty, sincerity, and dignity. He'd certainly never get hung up on that sort of thing. Probably the only person Andrew could be sure of, and who was surrounding him now. Any one of those friends would set him up for their own gain, and so did he. He also wondered what he was doing all this for. He used to think it was for Helen. They seemed like the perfect couple, like Bonnie and Clyde. But now there's only hatred between them, and then there's money. Except it's just a piece of paper. The only use for them is to take whatever they can give him. For example, he bought a huge new house. He didn't need it, but his status demanded it. It turned out that the new house had a lot of extra expenses. For example, he had to hire a staff of servants, a maid, a cook, a security guard, a manager, he told his wife. Helen shrugged his shoulders at the hiring. I don't know how to hire staff. She rolled her eyes. I don't know how either. You bought the house. You run it. He settled the matter. The maid was a woman in her 50s he'd hired on the recommendation of an acquaintance. The cook and the security guard found themselves on their own. Rugged, pumped up, a grandfather, hired as a cook, and an equally huge young guy as a guard. The grandfather said he could take over as manager. Andrew was fine with that. Helen liked the new house. Of course, their apartment was luxurious and comfortable, but still a house is a different scale. How nice to show it to her friends and periodically throw phrases like, "And this is our billiard room and handmade table." I don't know if it's something from Italy or if my husband didn't want to make such a big bathtub. He said the costs were crazy. And I said either the tub or we get a divorce. The girlfriends laughed. Then they all went to the gorgeous veranda to drink coffee and admire the view of the garden. What a handsome gardener you have, Alice remarked, a tall, thin blonde. Helen waved her hand. Yeah, my husband hired him somewhere. I think he's a security guard, but he likes to garden too. So he asked for an extra rate. I'd spend all my time on the veranda with a gardener like that, Julia said dreamily. She and Alice were like two peas in a pod. Breasts, lips, shiny hair. Only Julia was brunette. The women laughed. Oh, come on, Helen said. I don't do that kind of thing. The women looked at each other perplexed. You should. Or do you still love your husband like that? Helen lowered her eyes. Of course I do, she said quietly. Women, don't be ridiculous, please. We all just love their money, Alice said. Julia nodded. You're the youngest of us, but by their standards, you're not anymore. Of course, it's good that he doesn't limit you in money, but he's probably been cheating on you for a long time. Helen felt her face grow new. He wouldn't dare. Of course, they're all so faithful and in love at first. Yeah, love to the grave and all that. Listen to the wise women, girl, and get yourself a good lover first. And this handsome security guard, the gardener, will do, and then you'll figure it out. Helen looked at the gardener. What's his name? Liam or Lance, I think. He looked nice. Okay, she would think about that later. Yes, living in a house with your own servants was definitely a new level. Helen still couldn't get used to it, as if she had finally gone from Cinderella to princess. At least she lives almost in a real castle. Helen didn't want to think about what made her live here. She also couldn't get used to the servants. All the staff hired by her husband seemed strange to her. For example, the maid was a huge, gloomy, immense-sized woman, as Helen had been described by her friend, as looking as if she wanted to kill. But judging by the description, it's very colorful, chuckled the pal. And how does it do its job? Well, she seems to be doing a good job. Well, don't worry. Then all the more reason not to cut your husband down. Trust me, that's a huge advantage. I hadn't thought of that. You should have. She scares me a little bit, Helen admitted. Sometimes I think she can't even talk. Believe me, darling, that's fine. Why would you want to listen to her babble? Really? Why? Helen replied, confused. But even more than the maid, she was intimidated by her grandfather, who was both cook and manager. Although he must have looked about 70 years old, he seemed very powerful. Sometimes Helen felt as if he was living through her with his gaze, as if he could read her mind. His cooking was unparalleled, though. It was quite unclear what spices the old cook used. The flavor of most of the dishes seemed unfamiliar, but it was delicious. He was a good manager, too. After a while, Helen began to notice strange things. For example, one morning she smelled jasmine in the house. She hated jasmine, but it was for a simple reason. Cindy Randolph loved jasmine tea. Her perfume had a hint of jasmine in it. Even the air freshener in the restroom had a jasmine scent. Every morning, Helen would make her mistress that hated tea, although she had no negative feelings towards jasmine before. But after what happened, every time she smelled the notes of jasmine, the image of her husband's first wife came into her mind. Even in her mind, she called her Cindy Randolph, always so airy and innocent, out of this world. She'd go out on the veranda in the morning, put on her white lace dress, ask Helen to make jasmine tea, and turn on the gramophone. And more often than not, the same record. The late professor had collected them all his life, and his daughter would listen to them periodically. How did this annoy Helen? Why was she so stupid and unaware of the world? Everything came so easily. Her father had provided everything, then handed it over to her husband to take care of. She didn't even have to work, but she, Helen, had to get everything on her own. Her father was an alcoholic, her mother a cleaner. They were always short of money. Helen went to all sorts of lengths to look her best. She carried her mother's cosmetics, went through her old clothes from the age of 13, started to howl at the market stalls, carried lipstick, nail polish, pantyhose, tops. The biggest thing she managed to steal was a pair of jeans. Still, no matter what she did, she couldn't compare to the kind of daddy's little girls who took for granted what she'd worked so hard to get, and she'd almost forgotten about it. But the smell of jasmine seemed to bring her back to a time when she had put everything on the line to win this life. Helen paced around the house, trying to find the source. It was hardly a perfume. The only other woman besides her in the house is the maid. She doesn't seem to use anything at all. Freshening air is also unlikely, but it's worth checking, or maybe it's something from the cleaning products. Tell me, Helen asked the maid, do we have anything at home that smells like jasmine and cleaning products or freshen the hive? It's just that I'm allergic to it. No, Helen, she replied sternly. All allergen and odorless scented candles and sticks, just like you ordered. Pomegranate, peppermint. Thank you, I got it. The next place we looked was the kitchen. There was a grim chef cutting salad. Good morning, Helen said cautiously. The grandfather glared at her. Hello. What would you like for breakfast? I don't care. Salad will do. You can go to the dining room. I'll serve breakfast in 5 minutes. Wow, he looks like a homicidal maniac or some kind of special forces. He talks like an English butler. Out loud, Helen said, "Is our tea jasmine, by any chance?" "I think I've been smelling it since this morning." "For your husband. I make tea with Melissa in the morning." "Unfortunately, we don't have jasmine, but I can go to the store this afternoon." "No," Helen said hastily. "Don't. I hate jasmine." For a second, she thought she saw a smirk flash across the manager's face. But he nodded immediately and replied seriously, "I hear you, Helen. No jasmine. Where else could the source of the odor be? A garden for sure. That Liam or Lance must have planted something there." After breakfast, Helen came out of the house. "The gardener, I think." The guard had done a good job. A few minutes later, she found him too. The guard had shot some shrubbery. "Hello," Helen called out to him. He turned around, handsome, tall, and strong. "Andrew has been recognizing Andrew a lot lately. It's been a long time since we've been together. 3 months, probably. What am I thinking?" The guard looked at her defiantly. "Helen, is there something you wanted to ask me?" "Yes," she answered confusedly. "Did you plant jasmine here by any chance?" "Jasmine?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "Yes, I smelled it this morning. I can't quite put my finger on it." The guard shook his head. "Sorry, it wasn't me. I'm a non-professional gardener after all, so I'm only tending to the floor for now. I haven't planted anything new here." He smiled sweetly. "Thank you," Helen said. "I got it." She went back into the house and got into bed. There were no more ideas. So where did that stupid smell come from? "I'm sure you'll be satisfied," Andrew said, smiling into the camera. The man on the laptop screen nodded contentedly. "We're counting on it. Andrew, see you then." The screen went blank at the meeting, and Andrew wiped the smile off his face with relief and exhaled. Finally, this day was over. He deserved to relax. The feeling that something bad was about to happen had been bugging him lately. Everything seemed to be going right though. Business was running smoothly. Even his wife had been busy with her life lately and wasn't giving him a hard time. "What's up?" "To the bar." His partner clapped him on the shoulder and added, "It's Friday night after all. I'll show you a place full of beautiful girls. Hunting people like us, what's that like?" The partner shrugged. "The rich ones, and they hunt us." "Well, were you born yesterday?" "Sure, you can see them from a mile away. They're young, beautiful. Once they're touched, they devour you with their eyes." Andrew grinned. "And what do they want to find? A husband? Well, ideally, yes. But the role of mistress will suit them just fine. I have a wife," the friend winked, "as we all do." The bar was hot, noisy. Of course, they had a VIP table, partitioned off with sheer, shimmering curtains and equipped with a separate air conditioner. It was cool there and had a view of the rest of the bar. Andrew leaned back blissfully in the leather chair and took a large sip of whiskey. They had been sitting here for the second hour. He was already relaxed, and the heaviness of the previous week seemed to dissolve into a glass of ice. Enough of just sitting around. And what's wrong with that? Me too. But we came here for a reason. I don't know what you want. Don't be stupid, partner. It's time to meet the girls. Look who's sitting there. He drunkenly woke up and pointed his finger at 2 girls. A slender blonde in a bright red dress and sat with a friend. The latter was shorter in stature. Ryzenka was a little fuller, but still very attractive. "What do you think of her?" And look to the left. "What are you doing?" "There are 4 of them." "So what? You don't think we can do it?" My friend drunkenly giggled. He splashed whiskey on his pants. "You're upset." He looked at the pop-up stain. "Let's go to the first one," Andrew suggested. "Where's the blonde in the red dress?" He raised his head and suddenly froze. "I found something better. Look at her." Apparently, just Andrew looked in the direction and froze. There was a girl looking right at him. Thick, shiny black hair was styled in a flawless bob. Huge green eyes were eye-aligned. Dressed in an off-white suit, Cindy whispered in surprise to him, "What did we get, friend?" He suddenly staggered and fell right on Andrew. "And what do you want?" The last glass was unnecessary. He tried to lift his friend up, but it was not possible to put him on the sofa at once. After making sure he wasn't going to fall anywhere, Andrew stood up to walk over to the mysterious stranger. He glanced over to where she was sitting, but the table was already empty. Was it just a vision? No, he definitely saw his ex-wife. It was her. Maybe she moved. He made his way through the crowd. No, Cindy wasn't at the bar. She'd gone outside. Several tipsy men were smoking near the entrance. After looking around confused, Andrew returned to the bar. He helped his friend home and then drove to his place. On the way, he thought back over and over again to what had happened at the bar. Could it have been Cindy? The girl at the bar had looked perfectly healthy. At the hospital, they'd made it clear that his wife would never walk again. And there was little chance she'd live long after that without proper care. Then it's just a coincidence. Just a very similar girl, or he's hallucinating. A week later, Helen went to a restaurant with her friends after a shopping trip. "Well," asked Alice, "how are things going with your gardener?" Helen blushed. "No, he's a tough nut to crack, isn't he?" Julia grinned. "No, I haven't done anything." "Boring. I'm a married woman. My husband is also a married man." Nevertheless, a week ago, he and yours went to the Carmel. To the Carmel, Alice joined in. "I see. What kind of Carmel?" Helen asked, perplexed. "A bar where rich men rank girls for the night." "I see. All right, girls, enough about them." Julia waved her hand. "Let's talk about the good stuff. We're having a charity party in a week. Everyone's already gotten invitations." "What kind of party?" Helen asked. Julia shrugged. "It's something about helping some people affected by something I don't remember." "Isn't it?" Alice interrupted her. "The main thing is to come with your husband in a beautiful dress. Listen to the representatives of the charity fund for half an hour. Make a contribution, and then you can have fun. Yeah, these nights are always memorable. Helen, you and your husband should definitely be there." The girl shook her head doubtfully. "I'm not sure I want to spend the whole evening with him." "You don't have to. You can sit together at the presentation, and then everyone can have as much fun as they want." "All right, I will." Back home, Helen decided to look in the garden. Liam was cutting something again. "Hello," she said to him. "Hello, Helen. What are you doing?" "Under the new bushes, I see." Helen walked carefully around him and smiled playfully. Probably any other man would have started to realize everything by now, but Liam only smiled politely. Then she decided to act directly. "You're on duty today, aren't you?" "Yes, keep me company at dinner." The offer, it turned out, surprised him. "I'm sorry, perhaps that would be inappropriate." "I'm asking." She made the most innocent eyes. "All right then. Helen, I'll be there." She let the manager go early in the evening. He kicked his wolf eyes at her again, but said nothing. Helen was worried. Strange when she was having an affair under Cindy's nose. It wasn't scary like that. On the contrary, it was funny to watch the knave professor's daughter suspect nothing. And now Helen was suddenly doubtful. "All right," she said to her reflection in the mirror. "Enough. I need new impressions. Especially Andrew is the first to start." She set the table herself and barely finished, cautious footsteps sounded behind her. Helen turned around. "I'm glad you came. I couldn't help but come." "Helen, just call me Helen. At least until no one else is here." "All right." They sat down at the table and started dinner. "Tell me about yourself," Helen asked. "Where did you go to school before?" "I graduated from medical school and studied to be a massage therapist." "Oh, wow." The topic came in handy. "I could ask you to give me a massage," the lady of the house said languidly. Liam shrugged. "Sure, right now." "Yes, if it's not too much trouble." "No problem." "Then let's go to the bedroom. It'll be more comfortable there." They went into the bedroom. Helen threw off her dress and stayed in her underwear. "Is that enough or not?" "It's quite enough. Lie on your stomach. Arms stretched out along your body and try to relax." Helen did as he asked. The adrenaline was finally kicking in. Liam's massage was good. However, it was quite decent. He didn't touch what he couldn't touch, and Helen hadn't yet figured out how to hint to him for more. "Well, I'll talk to him about neutral topics, and then it'll just happen." "Tell me about your work as a masseur," Anna asked in a gentle voice. "But it's not that uninteresting." "I'd love to hear about it. but most of the time I worked with difficult patients. What kind of patients? But for example, with those who were injured after accidents, falls from heights, industrial accidents, car accidents. Helen suddenly felt her back covered with the sweat of a car accident. In a weak voice, she repeated, "Yes," Liam confirmed eagerly. "People sometimes get into terrible accidents. You know, if they get behind the wheel, drunk or out of it, they just can't control themselves in dangerous areas. Like bridges." "Yes," Helen repeated quietly, "bridges." In the ensuing silence, the phone suddenly rang. "Oh, sorry, it's my security guard looked at the screen. The alarm has gone off. What does that mean?" "Possible trespassing." "I'm sorry, I'll have to check. He's gone." Helen sat on the bed and threw on a robe. She was shaking all over. "It's just a coincidence. It's just a coincidence. It's just a coincidence." After all, it wasn't like Liam had said anything wrong. It just turned out that he was a massage therapist who worked with people who had survived car accidents. It's not that uncommon. It's just that her brain is releasing this information out of fear. If she pushed someone from a height, she'd have noticed that part of his sentence. Enough to think about, of course. And the continuation of the evening with the guard could be forgotten. She would remember the accident every time she looked at him. She was with Andrew at the crash site. Cindy had already been taken to the hospital. She and Andrew were on their way home. They stopped at the bridge, went downstairs, while the car looked like a child's toy that had been run over by a truck. There was blood spatter on the seat, the remnants of the windshield. It was creepy. She got goosebumps at the time, and Andrew said to her, "What a nightmare. How could this have happened?" Then she realized that she had to pull herself together and said as calmly as possible, "Well, everything turned out just fine for us. It must be fate." He looked at her suspiciously, as if he would guess everything. He'd say it was her fault. But instead of an accusation, he only nodded, "Yes, it must be fate." How long had it taken her to find the right drug? It had to be undetectable. Standard forensics. I'm sure the victim would have been tested at the hospital by now. We also had to consider the speed of action, so that Cindy Randolph didn't pass out too soon before she got behind the wheel, or too late when he got to work. Helen finally found what she was looking for. It was an old drug used to sedate and immobilize animals before experiments. Nowadays, such drugs are no longer considered humane. The effects of this substance on people personally were told by an old lab technician. It was with Goblina, half-blind grandfather, who suffered from dementia and worked only because the rector did not have the guts to fire him. As an absentia, for some not the most important credit, was given an assignment to help disassemble his old lab assistant. That's when, among other things, he told her about this drug. And now they don't make it anywhere anymore. Do you know what would happen if a person drank it? No, Helen replied politely. Why would anyone drink it? The old lab technician laughed. We had such a case many years ago. With students, of course. I was just starting to work then. I remember there was a general cleaning at the university, and the students were doing it, so they found this solution. It had an interesting smell, something between flowers and fruit. They thought it was some kind of tincture, so they drank it. Helen guessed. That's right, Sweetheart. And about 15 minutes after they drank it, they got a bad headache. They started to feel dizzy, nauseous. Then they all passed out. Wow, aha, you know what the best part is? When they took them all to the toxicology ward, it took the doctors a long time to figure out what happened. Standard tests showed nothing. So how did they find out the truth? After the guys came to, they told us everything. The effect of the drug was strong but short-lived, so the drug was quickly out of their system. That's correct. The old man gave it to Helen Forgotten. They're disposing of her properly. Honey, even though this liquid is 100 years old, I'm sure this stuff still works. I'd hate to see anyone get hurt. Of course, Helen smiled. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. It's the day of the charity party. Are we sure we don't have to spend the whole evening together? Andrew asked. Helen rolled her eyes. I told you we have to take a picture together at the entrance, then sit through a presentation from the charity. After that, you make a contribution. Then the party starts, and then we'll do whatever we want. I mean, separately. I'm totally fine with that. Something slammed next to them. The couple flinched. It's just a window sash. I'm not blind, I can see it. You've been so jumpy lately. You too? Any reason? Did they look at each other? No, I'm fine. But I'm fine too. Helen looked him over from head to toe. You have to make your husband look good. Then she shifted her gaze to her reflection. In the mirror, the dress fit perfectly, and her hair and makeup were just right. Only her eyes reflected fear, and with good reason. Lately, Helen had noticed that strange things were happening around her. For example, recently on the table in the living room, she found a magazine about real estate, repair, interior design, and so on. Probably left over from the renovation, Helen thought. The maid had pulled it from somewhere and didn't dare to throw it away. She picked it up and was about to throw it in the hamper when her eyes fell on the cover. The house was the same house that Cindy had inherited from the professor. The very house she and Andrew had gotten, tricked and hastily sold. The very house whose money had been the seed money for the fortune they now had. It's just a coincidence, Helen said aloud. I'm putting too much importance on it. She'd also smelled the damned jasmine twice. Moved all the candles in the house, sticks to freshen. Checked her husband's room, went into the room where the cleaning supplies were kept. Nothing. I'm done thinking about it. I have a lovely evening ahead of me. Though she'd been to many events before, this was the first time Helen had seen such a scale. When she and her husband were photographed, she suddenly felt naked, almost vulnerable. It seemed that all these people looking at them knew the whole truth about her. Helen struggled to keep herself in control. She also saw that Andrew was nervous for some reason too. Something's going on with him. Business problems. Finally, everyone settled back into their seats. Helen smiled at her friends. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Andrew nod to his friends. Okay, socials are done. See the presentation, make contributions. We can stop pretending to be a happy family. Immersed in her musings, Helen didn't notice how it had started. She came to her senses when the host of the event had already said the opening remarks about the organization they would be giving contributions to. The presentation had begun. After a few minutes, Helen was horrified to realize that this organization was raising money for victims of car accidents. She bowed and looked at her husband. Andrew sat pale, small droplets of sweat glistening on his temple. So I'm not the only one thinking about this right now. The thought made me feel better for some reason. But it couldn't be a coincidence. And if it wasn't a coincidence, what was it? Let's look at what kind of trauma a particular incident can cause. The screen flashed with images of a car driving along a forest road, picking up speed. Helen thought that the driver's head flashed through the window of the car. A girl with black hair. The car flew off the bridge and fell into the river. It happened so suddenly that the people sitting in the audience gasped. The following injuries can be sustained in this accident: broken forearms, broken femurs, broken pelvic bones, and ruptured spleen. There is also a high probability of serious damage to the spine. Helen sighed convulsively. She was short of breath. She really wanted to get up and leave. You can't. She couldn't. What would they think of me? She turned her head and looked at her husband. He looked even worse. Pale, wet, he stared straight ahead and seemed to be concentrating all his efforts on not fainting. Finally, the presentation was over. Don't forget to make a contribution, muttered Helen Andrew. Quickly, she stood up and walked towards the exit. It felt a little lighter outside. The cool evening air mulled over her, and Helen could clearly feel how wet her back was. She knew she should go back out there to the humans and continue acting like nothing had happened. But she didn't have the energy to do that. What's the pilot doing? She heard a voice behind her. She tried to put on a smile, but it came out as a pathetic grimace. Yes, it was Stuffy, she answered. Alice nodded sympathetically. I know, I got drunk on champagne at a banquet once. I threw up all night. Helen smiled weakly. Let's go. Her friend took her hand. Drink water with ice and lemon, and you'll feel better. And we should eat something. All right. When they got back to the gym, Helen first looked for her husband. He was sitting surrounded by other businessmen. She saw that there was an empty glass of whiskey in front of him, and a second glass in his hands, also almost empty. His gaze was already a little mouth-focused. On his cheeks, a blush protruded. But he seemed to have calmed down a bit. That's a good thing. They don't need panic right now. Why are you frozen? She heard her friend's voice. Let's go have some fun, have a drink. Helen shook his head negatively. Gotta keep a clear head. Alice poked, waved to a passing waiter, and took 2 glasses from his tray. Drink. She handed the champagne to her friend. You look like you've seen a ghost. Helen looked at the glass. And really, maybe she had enough for today. She resolutely reached out her hand, took the glass, and took a big gulp, leaving only a little drink at the bottom. That's another matter. Let's go dancing. Wait. Helen drank the champagne herself, already signaled to the waiter, took a second drink of champagne, and poured it into herself without hesitation. Helen. Alice laughed. I like your boldness. The alcohol had taken away a little of the fear and panic, but some unpleasant feeling inside remained. Helen, looking around occasionally, said someone was following her. She drank, danced with her friends, even tried to flirt with the waiters, but still felt a growing inner tension. Okay, friend, let's step back. Helen obediently nodded and allowed her friend to lead her away. They sat down in the corner on some sort of couch, away from the crowd of drunk people. Cheering people up. What's going on with you? I can see you're a nervous wreck. And not just tonight, but lately. Helen looked at Alice. She was used to these women always being spectacular, cynical, and carefree. And this one was now looking at her in a truly sincere, caring way. At some point, she wanted to tell Alice everything, so that they could become really close friends, so that Helen could open up to someone, stop pretending. No, she couldn't. It was unlikely that her friend would understand her. Helen imagined with what disgust Alice would look at her for a murderer, for a cheat, for a liar, for a thief. A lot has happened lately. Helen said weakly, with her husband, trouble, and I'm kind of tired of everything. I must be nervous or depressed or something. Alice nodded understandingly and took her hand gently. I understand. I had one myself a year ago. Don't worry. I'll text you the number of my therapist tomorrow. He'll help you. And if you're not ready yet, you should at least just rest. Go somewhere in the Maldives, Bali, or even Turkey. Live there for a week in the sea to swim in the flirt with the bartender will drive. And that pail is quite accurate, said Helen. I have to leave now and call you a car. Oh, please. If you want, I can go with you. Alice said softly. Helen tried to smile and turned towards her friend, trying not to look her in the eye. Thank you for everything you've done for me, but I'll probably come and go to bed. And you hang yourself. In the car, she opened the window. It felt lighter in the cool night air. A round white blind moon was running across the sky behind them. Helen would arrive home now and go straight to bed. In the morning, she would wake up early and buy tickets for the nearest flight. It doesn't matter where, as long as it's warm and far away from here. He won't even bring a suitcase. He would throw a few things in a small bag and buy the rest on the spot. Home was quiet and dark. She walked through, turning on lights everywhere. It seemed the air smelled like the damned shift again. The smell made even the alcohol drain from her head, and her consciousness clear. Fear and anxiety stabbed her brain with blunt needles again. She wanted to run. All right, Helen said quietly. I'll go to bed. At that time, there was the sound of cars driving in from outside. She tensed up. Footsteps were heard on the path. Who is it? Coming to their house this late. Paths of sweat ran down her back again. Helen looked around in horror, searching for something to grab for protection. As luck would have it, there was nothing. Hi. What are you doing up? It was her husband. Helen breathed a sigh of relief. She hadn't expected him back so early, and he looked like he was making sense. Probably sobered up in the fresh air, too. You're early? You're back even earlier. What's also restless at heart? He grinned. I can't understand what's going on with me lately. It's like I'm going crazy. Every day it gets worse and worse. She nodded. Me too. What do you think is going on? I don't know. But today at the presentation, I was ready to sunbathe and run out of the auditorium. Me too. What do you think is going on? He repeated stubbornly, apparently hoping his wife could give him an explanation that would calm him down. I don't know, it's not exactly a coincidence. I think it's karma. Retribution. It's come upon us after all these years. I don't believe in that kind of nonsense. Andrew chuckled. I didn't either. But how can you explain what's happening to us? What's happening to us? Look at you, Helen, and look at me. We're unhappy. We're scared. We startle at every sound. We don't sleep well at night. She sighed. There was nothing to object to. It's because of what we did, her husband continued. She got scared. Stop it. Helen tried to speak firmly, but her voice shook. Stop infecting everyone. It could all be explained logically by moving to a new house, over work, alcohol. The husband grinned drunkenly. But over work? Okay, I'm going to bed. He walked up the stairs and turned right. Andrew had a separate bedroom there. Helen gave him a silent glance. Okay, I have to go to bed too. I don't want to think about anything else tonight. She went upstairs to her room. She didn't even have the energy to take a shower. Helen could only undress and collapse into bed. Despite her tiredness, sleep didn't come. The room was stuffy, and the smell of it. It was probably also because of the moon. It was shining so brightly through the bedroom window. Out of spite, Helen suddenly began to think that the full moon was a time of mysticism, witches, ghosts, and ghosts. Maybe Cindy Randolph had died and her spirit was taking its revenge. What kind of nonsense is that? Helen sat up in bed. She should take a shower, or at least open the windows so it wouldn't be so stuffy. She went to the window and opened the wide sashes. The moon illuminated everything around them as far as the horizon. Their neatly trimmed yard and garden. Her thoughts suddenly returned to Liam, or rather to his story about the victims of car accidents. Then she thought again about the charity event. The footage of the crash of the woman with black hair in the driver's seat. Suddenly, she thought she saw something white between the trees. She looked closely. No, nothing. Then again, something flashed. Helen squinted and saw the outline of a human figure. A woman's. What is it? Someone's trespassing on their property. We should call security or at least wake her husband. But her feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, and the figure was getting closer. The dense trees hid her, or on the contrary, her white dress shone brightly in the moonlight. It was already clear that a girl in a white dress with long black hair was approaching the house. Helen froze. The figure stopped. Helen watched as the girl slowly raised her head. The skin on her face was white, and Helen suddenly saw clearly the bright green eyes staring back at her. No, she almost shouted and sent from the balcony. No. Helen slammed the window sashes shut with a clatter. She had never been so scared before. She jumped out of the bedroom and ran to her husband's room. Andrew screamed. She swung open the door to his bedroom. The room was empty. Windows open, crumpled blankets lying by the bed. It became even more frightening. With trembling fingers, she picked up the phone and dialed the security number. There were long beeps, but no one answered. What to do? Call the police. What would she tell them? She'd seen a ghost in white, and her husband had left the house in the middle of the night. Would they come to something like that? They'll think she's drunk. And how long would they drive here? Maybe Andrew just decided to keep going out and left, but something told her it wasn't that simple. And why aren't the guards answering? Helen gathered her courage and left the room. The house was quiet. She cautiously went down to the first floor, saw that there was a light on in the hallway and the front door was open. Her knees trembled. There was nothing to do but gather her wits, get out of the house and survey the area. She walked slowly through the hallway and out into the street. On the one hand, she should have called out to Andrew, but on the other, she might attract someone with her scream. Who a ghost? Stop thinking about it. I'm a grown man. I don't believe in that nonsense. But it's easy to say that to yourself during the day, but at night, by the light of the moon, when she saw a girl in a white dress a few minutes ago, and her husband disappeared from the room. It's harder to believe that ghosts don't exist. It's okay. She whispered to herself, it's okay. Helen walked slowly down the center path of the park. No one was there. Where was the guard? She forced herself to walk all the way to the gate. She didn't meet anyone on the way. If there was a ghost, it was on her path now. He didn't get caught. Helen got ready to walk back. She heard a voice behind her. Her heart stopped, but then she realized it was her husband's voice. She turned around. Andrew was staring at her in his pajamas, pants, barefoot, spiky hair, and a completely mad face. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "What are you doing here?" "In the garden at night, almost naked." He looked around fearfully, as if he was afraid that her screams would attract attention. Andrew put his finger to his lips. She might hear you." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. Who was she? Her voice was hoarse, probably because her mouth was dry from fear. Her husband looked at her fearfully and waved his arms. He looked completely mad. "Let's go inside," Helen suggested in a trembling voice. "Yes," the husband replied absent-mindedly. "I hope she won't get there." The mistress of the house wrapped her arms around herself. Only now she noticed that she had run out in her nightgown. She must look as ridiculous as her husband. At least it's a good thing no one can see them or is seeing them. "Do you know where our guard is?" Helen asked as they walked toward the house. The husband shrugged indifferently. Probably she killed him, or put him to sleep, or had his ox sucked out by a hypnotist. The soul. I don't know. Anyway, stop it, Helen said sharply. The hair on the back of her neck stirred, though. It was a little easier at home. She locked the door and followed her husband into the kitchen. He was already pouring himself a whiskey. "Do you want a splash?" he asked carelessly. She nodded. "What was that?" Helen asked. "What did you see?" He drank in the indifferent look, stared somewhere in the wall and shrugged. "I don't know, Helen, a ghost." "A ghost, a hallucination." In a hoarse voice, she clarified Cindy Randolph. Her husband nodded doomedly and asked, "Did you see her too?" "I don't know, but there was a girl in a white dress with black hair in our garden. It might have just been someone trespassing on our property." He frowned. "Helen, don't kid yourself. You know perfectly well what we saw." She turned pale. "It can't be. It's a hoax." He poked. "Yes, these are our buddies who know we killed my ex-wife." Thought it was a joke. He raised his head and looked at Helen with a suddenly sober gaze. "Except that no one knows about it but us. Don't be ridiculous. First of all, we didn't kill her. It's the same as killing her." "Andrew, stop talking about it." He laughed hoarsely. "Do you have any other explanation for what's been happening to us for the last month?" They were silent. They drank another glass. The house was quiet. And then suddenly there was a click. Helen suddenly realized that it was the front door opening. The fresh night air rushed into the kitchen, laced with the lingering scent of jasmine. There was that damned smell again. Andrew groaned and wrapped his arms around his head. "So you could feel it too." Helen didn't have time to finish the thought. Music came from the street. They recognized the tune immediately. Cindy used to play it all the time on the gramophone her father had left behind. Collecting his records. The music was getting louder and louder. Andrew stood up. "Let's not go in there. I'm begging you." Helen shouted, grabbing her husband's arm. He shook his head doomishly and walked toward the music. She suddenly realized that this was the right thing to do. They couldn't just hide from this forever. It had to end today. Together now, they walked outside. The moon still flooded the garden with light. Music was coming from somewhere in the depths, as if a gramophone stood in the shadows of the trees. The gramophone was also a ghost. A faint wonder flashed through the mistress's mind. She and her husband walked slowly, doomed, as if they were going to an execution. Helen was hardly even surprised when, at the back of the garden, she saw a girl with long black hair letting loose past her shoulders. In a white long dress, with an equally white face, barefoot. Of course it was her. Huge green eyes looked at them calmly. Cindy said quietly, almost in a whisper to Andrew, and cried. Helen even watched with some inner amazement as her spouse knelt down, covered her face with her hands, and began to shake with sobs. The girl slowly shifted her gaze to her, and Helen herself wanted to kneel down. "Why are you frozen, silly? Run away, run away," she shouted to herself, but her legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. Instead, she asked, "What do you want?" A confession. The phantom said quietly, "Forgive us," shouted Andrew. "Forgive us." His answer was a cold, indifferent stare. "Tell me," whispered the phantom. "Tell me, what have you done to me?" Helen suddenly felt how dizzy she felt. Air became scarce. Her chest squeezed as if with discs. It seemed that a few more seconds and she would suffocate. Now Helen was ready to do anything to get rid of this terrible feeling of heaviness and hopelessness. "I poisoned you," she exhaled. "At work I got a drug that could not be detected in the tests. The morning of your accident, I put it in your tea. You should have gotten dizzy, nauseous, passed out." The ghost nodded slightly. She ordered next. "Then I tricked you," almost shouted the rendition of Andrew. "Promised treatment in Germany, and himself forced to sign documents to transfer the rights to the house to me. Next, then I sold your house, withdrew all the money from our account, and ran away with Helen. The ghost turned to her you. That confirms it." Helen nodded, feeling tears streaming down her face. "Yes, that's what happened." "Oh well, that's great." Suddenly, the ghost said in a very casual manner and clapped his hands. "Cut, cut." At the same moment, the music stopped. Two men came out of the bushes. One of them was holding a camera. Liam asked Helen in surprise, "And you?" Andrew was as surprised as she was. "What's going on?" Andrew said sternly to the old man who was their cook and manager, "What have you done now?" "A heartfelt confession of your crime against Cindy Randolph. It's all on camera. See you in court." There's the sound of sirens approaching from far away. "It's not ghosts," Cindy said cheerfully. "It's the police." "Yes," said William, stretching blissfully on the chaise lawn. "But we pulled it off too." Cindy laughed and lay back too, so that the tan was as even as possible. "Yeah, playing the part of a ghost was interesting. Being a gardener and a security guard was much more boring. No kidding. You and your grandfather were still turning all those hoaxes." He shrugged his shoulders. "Yes, what business is there?" Periodically, through the ventilation smells of jasmine. Letting a magazine with a picture of the house to plant grandfather on the spy skills, we came in handy. A sigh sounded behind their backs. Stephen, with a cocktail in his hands, took a vacant lounger nearby. "I'm not much of a spy. I'd only worked in intelligence for a few years. Then I studied to be a rehabilitation specialist, but I remember some of the old tricks. It's a good thing we still have our old connections, but if it hadn't been for the mind machine, we never would have realized this plan." The granddaughter shrugged her shoulders. "Come on. The most difficult thing was to organize a charity event. It was lucky that an old acquaintance of my father's for justice worked on the board of the foundation." William raised his glass. "To justice." Cindy cheered. "Here's to a well-deserved vacation," said Stephen, though he wasn't in favor of it. "Just a week or two in Alanya on the sand we certainly deserve." "Yes, grandfather, notwithstanding all and started." "Cindy is the oldest." "Fuck you. Not the least bit offended by it. Try it." At the same time, a cook and a special agent undercover to work, and also to restrain themselves, so that in a dream of these creeps do not strangle. But grandfather Cindy affectionately took him by the hand. "You're my gold, professional. Or else." After half an hour, Stephen got up. "Okay, young people, rest, and I'll go swimming in the pool." Cindy looked at him and turned to William. "So Helen tried to seduce you too?" William raised his eyebrows. "What do I hear in your voice?" "Jealousy, perhaps." "You know that," William said fondly and ran his thumb over her cheek. "I only want you, I know," she said softly and kissed him. "Shall we get married?" He asked carelessly, but Cindy noticed the excitement in his voice. "Is it because I'm rich now?" "Of course," Cindy shrugged. "Why wouldn't it be? It's the first pancake. Are you going to be the perfect husband for me,